Section 1. The town that time forgot Springfield's impossible geography and hidden architecture. Somewhere in America, there is a town with a nuclear power plant, a harbor, an active volcano, a desert, a mountain range, a ski resort, a rainforest, and a beachfront. It borders at least 4 different states simultaneously. Its zip code has never been confirmed. Its position on any map shifts depending on which episode you're watching. Federal agencies have investigated it. The EPA has sealed it under a dome, and nobody who lives there has ever once stopped to wonder how all of those geographic features ended up within a 20-minute drive of each other. That town is Springfield, and tonight, we're going to spend a long, slow, unhurried few hours pulling it apart. Not the jokes, not the cultural legacy, the bones of the thing. The architecture, the geography, the buried details that the show has been dropping into the background of episodes for 36 years, trusting that most people would be too busy laughing to notice. This isn't a list of Easter eggs. This is something closer to archaeology. And the things we find down in the lower layers of Springfield are stranger and darker and more carefully constructed than most people have ever realized. So, get comfortable. Let your breathing slow down. There is no urgency here. We have 4 hours. And Springfield isn't going anywhere. It never does. Let's start with something that should be fundamentally impossible and has been hiding in plain sight since the very first season. Springfield does not have a geography. It has a collection of geographies, layered on top of each other like transparencies, each one contradicting the ones beneath it, and the whole impossible stack presented as if it were the most natural thing in the world. In one episode, the town sits on the coast. Springfield has a harbor, ships dock there. The ocean is visible from certain hills. Bart has surfed in Springfield's waters. The beach exists. It is a real, functional part of the town's landscape, and the show treats it with the same casual confidence it treats the nuclear power plant or the elementary school. In another episode, Springfield is deep in the interior of the country. Landlocked, no coast anywhere near it. The town is surrounded by farmland and flatlands, the geography of the American heartland, the kind of landscape that exists 1,000 miles from any saltwater. In another episode, there are mountains. Serious mountains. The kind with ski resorts and snowpack and elevation markers. Springfield has a ski lodge. Homer has fallen down the mountain. The mountains are there. They are real within the show's universe, and they coexist without explanation alongside the harbor and the farmland. The volcano comes up occasionally. Springfield has a volcano. It has erupted. The show depicts this and moves on. There is Springfield Gorge, the famous gorge that Homer attempted to jump on a skateboard in one of the most replayed moments in the show's history. That gorge is deep and dramatic and entirely inconsistent with the coastal, flat, and mountainous geographies the show also depicts. A gorge of that scale requires a specific kind of terrain formation. It does not exist casually alongside a harbor and a ski mountain and a desert. Yes, there is also a desert. Springfield has desert terrain in certain episodes. Sand dunes, heat shimmers, the specific kind of scrubland that exists in the American Southwest. This desert is close enough to town that characters drive to it within the runtime of a single episode. Now, here is the thing that makes all of this more than just a comedy show's indifference to continuity. The show is aware of this. The writers have always been aware of this. Springfield's geographic impossibility is not an oversight. It is a design decision, and it has been maintained with remarkable consistency across hundreds of writers over 36 years. Every time a new writing team joins the show, they inherit the rule. Springfield is everywhere. Commit to it. Don't explain it. Let the geography shift and contradict and stack up without resolution. The question worth sitting with tonight is why? Why would a show this carefully constructed, staffed by some of the most educated and detail-oriented writers in the history of American television, choose to make its primary setting geographically incoherent? The surface answer is the one the creators have given in interviews. Springfield is meant to be universal. Every American viewer should be able to look at Springfield and see something familiar, something that resembles the town they grew up in, regardless of where that town actually was. A viewer from coastal Maine and a viewer from landlocked Kansas, and a viewer from the Arizona desert should all be able to find something recognizable in Springfield's landscape. So, the show gives them all something. This explanation is true, and it is also incomplete. Because the writers didn't just make Springfield's geography vague or unspecified, they made it actively contradictory. They didn't leave the town's location ambiguous. They filled in that ambiguity with specific, concrete details that directly conflict with each other. That's a different choice. Ambiguity is passive. Active contradiction requires effort. Someone had to write the harbor episode knowing the mountain episode existed. Someone had to write the desert knowing the coast was already established. These contradictions weren't accidents. They were choices, and they were made repeatedly by different people over decades. What that means is that Springfield's geographic impossibility is not a failure of world building. It is the world building. The contradictions are the point. The town that exists everywhere simultaneously is more interesting and more useful as a fictional space than any town pinned to a specific location could ever be. A Springfield that is definitively in, say, Ohio, is a town that makes sense within the rules of American geography. A Springfield that is simultaneously on the coast and in the mountains and in the desert is something else entirely. It is a town that operates by different rules. A town where the normal constraints of physical reality have been suspended or overridden or forgotten. And once you start looking at Springfield through that lens, the geography stops being a cartoon convenience and starts being evidence. Evidence of what? Let's keep pulling. The architecture of Springfield is almost as strange as its geography, and it has received far less attention. Most fictional towns have a consistent architectural identity. You know what Mayberry looks like. You know what Stars Hollow looks like. The buildings have a coherent style, a shared visual language that tells you where and when and what kind of place you're in. Springfield's architecture is a layered, contradictory accretion of styles from completely different eras and completely different regions of the country. It makes a kind of sense at first glance, because most real American towns also have mixed architecture, old buildings next to new ones, Victorian houses next to ranch-style homes. But Springfield's architectural contradictions go deeper than the normal mixed bag of American urban development. The Simpson house itself is an interesting case. It's a two-story home with a design that places it somewhere in the broad category of American suburban construction from the mid-20th century. It has a basement, it has an attic, it has the kind of backyard that suggests a certain economic class, working class but stable, the kind of house a man who works at a nuclear power plant could realistically afford on a safety inspector's salary. Except the house's interior is impossible. The floor plan of the Simpson house has never been consistent across episodes. Rooms appear and disappear. The basement changes size and configuration. The kitchen's relationship to the living room and hallway shifts depending on the needs of the scene. The attic is enormous in some episodes and a cramped crawl space in others. The garage, when it appears, seems to materialize from a house that does not clearly have space for a garage. This is a known phenomenon in animation, and it is usually attributed to the practical challenges of maintaining consistent floor plans across hundreds of episodes produced by different animators. That explanation is valid and probably correct on a production level. But from a storytelling level, the Simpson house behaves like a house that adjusts itself to the needs of its inhabitants. It has exactly as much space as each episode requires. It is bigger when the story needs room and smaller when the story needs confinement. The house is responsive. It is cooperative. It is, in a way that no real house ever is, perfect. And the same is true of Springfield's commercial architecture. Moe's Tavern is one of the most detailed recurring interior locations in the show. The bar has a consistent aesthetic, dark wood, low lighting, the particular squalor of a dive bar that has been a dive bar for a very long time. But its dimensions change. Its exits appear and disappear. The position of the bar relative to the booths and the back door and the restrooms is fluid enough that you cannot draw a reliable floor plan from watching the show. Springfield Elementary School is a building that seems to add and subtract wings between episodes. The auditorium exists. The gym exists. The cafeteria exists. The basement boiler room where groundskeeper Willie lives in his groundskeeping shack, which is itself somehow inside the school despite being described as a shack, exists. Whether all of these spaces could fit within the building as shown from the exterior is a question the show has never been interested in answering. The nuclear power plant is the most architecturally ambitious building in Springfield, and it has its own set of internal impossibilities. The reactor core is accessible in ways that no real nuclear facility would permit. The control room where Homer works has more in common with a 1950s science fiction film's idea of a nuclear control room than with any real operational nuclear facility. The plant has a cafeteria, a gift shop at some point, executive offices, maintenance tunnels, and apparently a basement with human skeletons, none of which have ever been mapped into a coherent whole. But here is the thing about the plant's architecture that nobody talks about. The power plant is visible from almost anywhere in Springfield. It sits on the edge of the town, near the river, and its cooling towers are the dominant feature of Springfield's skyline. In establishing shots, you can always see the plant. It is always there, in the background, in the peripheral vision of every outdoor scene. The plant is omnipresent in Springfield's visual landscape, in a way that no real building in any real town is omnipresent. Even famous buildings in cities known for their architecture, the Eiffel Tower, the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, they dominate their skylines, but they don't appear in every single exterior establishing shot. The Springfield nuclear plant does. It is always visible. It is always watching. That is an architectural and visual choice. The show's directors and animators over 36 years and across hundreds of different people have consistently kept the plant in frame, consistently reminded the viewer that it is there, consistently positioned it as the background against which every outdoor Springfield scene plays out. The plant doesn't just power Springfield, it watches Springfield, and the show has made sure you always know it. Let's move into Springfield's downtown, because the commercial district of this town has its own buried weirdness that rewards close attention. Shelbyville is Springfield's nearest neighbor town, and the relationship between the two places is one of the show's long-running background details. They have a rivalry. They have competing high school sports teams. There are Shelbyvillians and Springfieldians, and the two groups do not especially like each other. The rivalry is old and its origins are absurd, as the show eventually reveals, going back to a dispute between the two towns' founders over whether cousins should be allowed to marry. But here is something worth noting about Shelbyville. The show has never established Shelbyville's geography relative to Springfield with any consistency. Shelbyville is sometimes depicted as a short drive away. In other episodes, it seems much farther. The road between the two towns appears and disappears. Characters drive to Shelbyville in what seems like minutes in some episodes and treat it as a significant journey in others. This matters because Shelbyville serves a specific narrative function. It is Springfield's mirror. It is the alternative version of the same town, the place where Springfield's residents can see what they might have become under slightly different circumstances. When Springfield sends a delegation to Shelbyville, or when Shelbyvillians cross into Springfield territory, the show is using the comparison to say something about what Springfield is. And what Springfield is, compared to its nearest alternative, is always slightly stranger, slightly more broken, slightly more compelling. Springfield has a Chinatown. The show established this early and has referenced it periodically across the run. Springfield's Chinatown exists as a distinct neighborhood with its own aesthetic and its own population, which raises quiet questions about the demographics of Springfield that the show has never directly addressed. Where did Springfield's immigrant communities come from? When did they arrive? How do they relate to the power structure of a town so thoroughly dominated by Mr. Burns's empire? Springfield has a little Italy. It has a part of town associated with organized crime, which we will get into more deeply in a later section. It has a waterfront district that has been depicted as both working class and somewhat dangerous. It has a wealthier residential area on the hill where the richer residents live, and it has the more modest neighborhoods where the Simpsons and their immediate neighbors are located. What Springfield lacks, and this is a detail worth noticing, is any kind of visible construction or expansion. The town exists in a kind of permanent mid-build that never actually builds anything new. New businesses appear and disappear between episodes. The nuclear plant has never been renovated or modernized in any visible way. The elementary school has never received the kind of infrastructure investment that most American schools eventually receive. The town's roads, its parks, its public buildings all exist in a state of perpetual maintenance that maintains the status quo without ever improving it. Springfield is a town that is always almost falling apart but never quite falls apart. And that too is a design decision. A town actively deteriorating would create narrative pressure for change. Springfield's peculiar form of arrested decay, always worn but never destroyed, always struggling but never collapsing, keeps the show's universe stable. Stable and static. The same town, forever, with different weather. Now the question of where Springfield actually is. This is the most discussed geographic question in the show's history, and it has received enough direct attention from the creators that we know more about it than we know about many of the show's other mysteries. And yet knowing more about it hasn't made the answer any clearer. If anything, the clarity has made the mystery deeper. Matt Groening, the show's creator, gave an interview to Smithsonian Magazine in 2012. In that interview, he confirmed what many fans had long suspected. He named Springfield after Springfield, Oregon. He grew up near it. He chose the name because Springfield is one of the most common city names in the United States, existing in dozens of states simultaneously, which made it perfect for a show about a town that is meant to represent everywhere. For approximately 48 hours after that interview was published, the mystery was solved. Springfield was in Oregon. The fans had an answer. And then the show kept airing, and the episodes that followed the interview placed Springfield in geographic contexts that were entirely inconsistent with Oregon. Oregon does not border Ohio and Kentucky and Nevada. Oregon does not have the kind of landscape the show depicts as Springfield's immediate surroundings in most episodes. The writers did not honor Groening's revelation. They kept doing what they had always done, which was to make Springfield consistent with wherever the current episode needed it to be. This tells you something important. The show's writers and the show's creator are not operating from the same map. Groening may have had Oregon in mind when he named the town, but the show itself has always been larger than any single geographic answer. The writers have consistently and deliberately chosen to keep Springfield unlocatable, and they have done this even when the creator himself gave them permission to stop. Why? The most honest answer is that Springfield's location is a kind of creative freedom. A town that is nowhere is a town where anything can happen. A town pinned to Oregon has an Oregon climate and an Oregon relationship to the rest of the country and an Oregon's worth of geographic constraints. A town pinned to nowhere has none of those constraints. It can snow in Springfield when the story needs snow. It can be tropical when the story needs tropical. The desert can appear when the story needs the desert. The coast is there when the story needs the coast. But there is a secondary answer that is more interesting and more troubling. A town that cannot be located cannot be regulated. The EPA, in the Simpsons movie, seals Springfield under a dome because the town's environmental contamination has become so extreme that containment is the only option. This is a federal agency taking extreme action against an entire town because of what the nuclear power plant and the general collapse of environmental standards have done to the surrounding environment. In the real world, that kind of regulatory action requires jurisdiction. It requires knowing what state you are in, what laws apply, which agencies have authority, which courts have standing. Springfield has no clear jurisdiction. It has been placed in enough different states across enough different episodes that no real regulatory framework could cleanly claim it. Burns's plant has been operating with 342 safety violations for decades without a consistent state environmental agency to answer to, because the state changes. The laws change. The authority changes. Springfield's geographic impossibility is not just a comedy device. It is, within the show's own logic, a legal shield. And the person who benefits most from that shield is the one person in Springfield wealthy enough and powerful enough to have designed it that way. We will come back to that thought. For now, hold it gently, and let's move deeper into the town's foundations. There is a detail about Springfield's civic infrastructure that the show has seeded across many episodes without ever drawing attention to it directly. Springfield has an enormous number of civic institutions for a town that seems to have a relatively modest population. It has a city hall, a courthouse, a police department, a fire department, 2 hospitals, a university, a community college, a museum of natural history, an art museum, an opera house, a symphony orchestra, a professional baseball team, a professional football team, a professional hockey team, a monorail system that was built and apparently abandoned, a trolley, a nuclear power plant, a water treatment facility, a sanitation department, an aquarium, a zoo, a theme park that has appeared in multiple episodes, and a harbor with associated maritime infrastructure. For a working-class town in an unspecified American state, this is an extraordinary density of civic and cultural institutions. Most actual small to medium American cities have a fraction of this institutional infrastructure. Most towns the size Springfield appears to be cannot support a professional baseball team, let alone a professional team in multiple sports. The show has never addressed this. It has never explained why Springfield has so much institutional density for a town of its apparent size and economic circumstances. Most of the time, these institutions exist to serve specific episodes and are not referenced again with any consistency. But consider what all of these institutions have in common. Almost all of them have, at some point in the show's run, been depicted as deeply dysfunctional, chronically underfunded, or outright corrupt. The police department is legendarily incompetent, headed by a chief who is consistently depicted as self-serving, lazy, and willing to bend or break the law for personal benefit. The city government is controlled by Mayor Quimby, a man so thoroughly corrupt that his corruption has become a running gag the show treats as a natural feature of the landscape. The schools are underfunded to the point of crisis. The hospitals are functional but barely. The courts dispense justice with a randomness that suggests a system more interested in performance than in outcomes. Springfield has more civic infrastructure than it should have, and almost all of that infrastructure is broken. The town is overbuilt and underfunctional. It has the skeleton of a thriving civic society and none of the operational health that skeleton should imply. This creates a specific kind of civic despair that the show captures perfectly, even when it is not trying to. Springfield has enough structure to look like a place where things should work. It has a police department, so crime should be addressed. It has courts, so justice should be available. It has a city government, so public resources should be managed responsibly. It has schools, so children should be educated. None of these promises are kept. The institutions exist, but they do not function. And the gap between the promise of the institution and the reality of its function is where Springfield's particular brand of civic sadness lives. That gap is not accidental. That gap is what the show has always been about, at its core, beneath the jokes and the guest stars and the increasingly surreal plots. Springfield is a town where the systems exist and the systems have failed, where the infrastructure is in place and the infrastructure does not work, where there are rules and the rules do not apply equally, where the people who are supposed to protect the community serve themselves and the people who depend on those protections have been left to manage without them. That is not a cartoon. That is a diagnosis. One of the strangest civic details in Springfield's background is the town's relationship to its own history. Springfield has been depicted, in various episodes, as having been founded under different circumstances and by different people. The founding of Springfield has been retold multiple times across the show's run, and the versions do not agree with each other. In one version, Springfield was founded by Jebediah Springfield, a folk hero whose legend is central to the town's civic identity. In another telling, Jebediah Springfield was not a hero at all but a con man, a fraud whose real name was Hans Sprungfeld and whose celebrated heroism was fabricated. In a third version, the town's founding involves a dispute between two groups of settlers that resulted in the establishment of both Springfield and Shelbyville as rival communities. These founding myths cannot all be true simultaneously. The show knows this. The episode in which Jebediah Springfield's heroic legend is revealed to be a fraud, Lisa the Iconoclast, is one of the most thematically rich episodes in the series. Lisa discovers documentary evidence that Jebediah was not a hero. She tries to bring this truth to the town's attention. The town resists. The town does not want the truth. The town needs its founding myth to be intact because without it, without the shared fiction of heroic origins, the community's sense of itself begins to dissolve. What Lisa discovers, and what the episode ultimately depicts her choosing not to fully expose, is that communities are held together by stories they tell about themselves, stories that may or may not be true. Stories whose accuracy matters less than their function. The story of Jebediah Springfield, the hero, gives the town a reason to feel proud of where it came from. Replacing that story with the truth, with the reality of a con man and a fraud, would not liberate the town. It would just leave it with nothing to hold on to. This is one of the show's most honest moments, and it sits in the middle of what is, on the surface, an episode about a school project about the town founder. The episode ends with Lisa choosing not to reveal the truth at the public festival honoring Jebediah's memory. She watches the townspeople celebrate their founding myth, and she keeps the evidence to herself. The show frames this not as cowardice but as wisdom. Some truths cost more than they give back. That is a troubling thought, and the show leaves it there, unresolved, which is exactly where Springfield leaves most of its troubling thoughts. Let's talk about the Gorge. Springfield Gorge has appeared several times in the show's history, but it is most famous as the location of one of the series' most replayed moments, Homer's failed skateboard jump across its width. The gorge is deep. It is wide. It is the kind of geologic feature that takes tens of thousands of years to form and requires specific conditions of rock type and water erosion to develop. It sits next to a residential suburb. This is, in geographic terms, genuinely bizarre. Gorges of the depth and width that Springfield Gorge appears to be are not features that appear in the middle of suburban landscapes. They are found in specific geological contexts, usually in the American West, in places like Utah, Arizona, and Colorado, where the right combination of rock formations and erosive forces has had millions of years to create dramatic landscape features. Springfield's Gorge exists in what appears from most episodes to be the American Midwest or Northeast, where this kind of geologic drama does not typically occur. The gorge is there because the show needed a gorge. It needed a dangerous, dramatic, fall-worthy geographic feature that could serve as the site of an escalating series of physical gags. And so, Springfield has a gorge. But here's what's interesting about the gorge from a continuity standpoint. It is referenced in multiple episodes across multiple seasons. It is not a one-episode invention that gets quietly forgotten. Characters reference it. Events that happen there get called back. It has established itself as a real part of Springfield's geography in a way that some of the show's other geographic inventions have not. What does a gorge, specifically, mean in a town like Springfield? A gorge is a wound in the landscape. It is a place where the ground has been opened up, where the surface has been cut through to reveal what's underneath. In Springfield, the gorge sits there in the background of the town's geography as a reminder that beneath the suburb, beneath the lawns and the cul-de-sacs and the nuclear plant and the elementary school, the ground is not what it appears to be. Open it up and you find a drop into darkness. That might be reading too much into an animation background, or it might be exactly the kind of detail that a show this carefully constructed has always intended. Springfield's geography is not incoherent. It is incoherent in specific, patterned ways that consistently return to the same ideas. The coast that appears and disappears. The mountains that are always there when someone needs to fall down them. The gorge that is always there when someone needs to nearly die. The desert that appears when someone needs to be lost. Springfield's geography is responsive. It gives the story what it needs. And a place whose physical reality responds to narrative necessity is a place where the normal rules of physical reality have been suspended. Which brings us back to where we started. Something is wrong with Springfield at a very fundamental level. Not in its characters, not in its institutions, but in the fabric of its physical existence. And the show has been depicting that wrongness for 36 years through the medium of impossible, contradictory, endlessly shifting geography. The town that exists everywhere exists nowhere. And in a place that exists nowhere, the normal rules of cause and effect, of consequence and resolution, of time and change, those rules don't have to apply. Springfield is free of reality. And the freedom terrifies if you look at it long enough. Before we move into the next section, leave a comment down below. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It always means a lot to know who's here. And if you're finding this relaxing, a subscription goes a long way. Section 2. The yellow question, what the Simpsons skin color actually means. Here is something that has been sitting in the middle of one of the most watched television shows in history for 36 years, visible in every single frame of every single episode, and almost nobody has ever stopped to genuinely examine it. Every human resident of Springfield is yellow. Not a little yellow. Not a pale, slightly warm complexion that might be described as yellowish in certain lighting conditions. Yellow. Unmistakably, uniformly, consistently yellow. A color that does not exist in the spectrum of real human skin tones. Not anywhere in the world, not in any population, not under any circumstances. And nobody in Springfield has ever mentioned it. The standard explanation, the one the show's creators and defenders have always reached for, is that the yellow skin is an aesthetic choice. Matt Groening chose yellow because it would stand out on television screens of the 1980s, because it was distinctive, because it would catch the eye of a viewer channel surfing past the show. Yellow was a practical decision rooted in the visual technology of the time. This explanation is true. It is also, by now, boring. We all know it. The yellow skin is an artistic choice. Yes, fine. But the artistic choice has been embedded in the show's world building for so long and so completely that it has taken on a life beyond its original practical rationale. The yellow skin is now a fact of Springfield's reality. And within that reality, it has implications. The most immediate implication is the one we touched on in the previous section. When visitors come to Springfield, they do not look the same as the residents. Guest characters, Characters who come from outside Springfield, characters who exist in the real world beyond the town's borders, are drawn differently. They have more naturalistic proportions. Their eyes are less dramatically large, their features are more recognizably human in their configuration, and their skin, sometimes, is not the Springfield yellow. The show has used this distinction deliberately and not always consistently, but enough that the pattern is visible. There is a difference between how the people of Springfield look and how people from outside Springfield look. Drawn into that difference is an implication that the show has never stated directly. The residents of Springfield look the way they do because of something that has happened to them in Springfield. Let's sit with that for a moment. Yellow skin is not a neutral characteristic in medical terms. Jaundice, which produces a yellowing of the skin, is a symptom of liver dysfunction, or blood disorders, or bile duct obstruction. It is a sign that something is not working correctly inside the body. Real, sustained, whole-body yellowing of the skin is not a color variation. It is a symptom. The people of Springfield have whole-body yellowing of the skin. Every person who lives in Springfield. Sustained, consistent, uniform. And nobody has ever brought it up. Not the doctors. Springfield has multiple doctors, most notably Dr. Hibbert, who has been treating the Simpson family and the wider community for the entire run of the show. Dr. Hibbert has commented on many unusual medical situations over the course of the series. He has laughed his characteristic laugh at diagnoses that should provoke alarm. He has delivered terrible news with a jolliness that implies a profound disconnection from the emotional reality of medicine. But he has never once noted that his patients are yellow. He has never once ordered blood work to investigate the systemic cause of Springfield's population-wide skin discoloration. Either Dr. Hibbert is catastrophically incompetent at noticing symptoms that are visible from across a room, or he considers the yellowing normal, or he knows what is causing it and has chosen, for whatever reason, not to pursue the question. Let's approach the yellow question from a different angle. If you accept the radiation theory of Springfield, the idea that the nuclear power plant's chronic leakage of radioactive material into the town's water supply and air has produced measurable biological effects in the local population, then the yellowing becomes a coherent data point. It becomes one more symptom in a population of living symptoms. Radiation exposure can cause significant changes to skin appearance over time. The effects are complex and depend on dose, duration, and type of radiation, but chronic low-level exposure to certain kinds of radiation, particularly the kinds associated with nuclear facility contamination, can produce dermatological changes that include discoloration, increased fragility, and changes to the skin's cellular structure. The show does not make this connection explicitly. It presents the yellow skin as a visual style choice and expects the audience to accept it as such. But within the logic of the show's own universe, the yellow skin has always been there as a potential symptom of exactly the kind of environmental contamination that the nuclear plant represents. And here is a detail worth noting. Blinky, the three-eyed fish, is green. Not fish-colored, not a natural shade of any real aquatic creature. Green, the same way Burns, after his weekly radiation treatments, glows green. The same way the nuclear waste that occasionally appears in the show is depicted as a glowing green substance. Green and yellow are neighbors on the color spectrum, and in Springfield, they are both colors associated with exposure to radiation. The fish turn green from the plant's runoff. The waste itself is green, and the humans are yellow. Not the same shade, but from the same part of the spectrum. From the same cause, perhaps, at different intensities, at different lengths of exposure, in different biological systems. The show uses color to tell you things it is not willing to say in dialogue. The color coding of Springfield's radiation exposure has been running for 36 years in the background, visible in every frame, and most people have accepted it as a stylistic choice without considering what it might mean inside the show's own logic. There is another angle on the yellow question that is more philosophical and perhaps more interesting than the medical one. In the history of American animation, the choice of skin color for characters has always carried a set of implications and assumptions that have changed over time. Early American animation defaulted to a kind of neutral, unspecified skin tone for its protagonist that was, in practice, a coded whiteness. The characters were presented as racially unmarked, their racial identity assumed rather than depicted, because the cultural default of the form was white. Matt Groening has said that he chose yellow for The Simpsons partly because yellow is a color that no human being actually is, which means it sidesteps the fraught question of what racial identity to assign to the family. The Simpsons are yellow. Yellow is not a race. Yellow is, in this framing, a kind of achieved neutrality, a way of making the family visually universal by making them visually impossible. This is a clever rationale, and it may be genuine, but it has an interesting side effect. By making the residents of Springfield yellow, the show creates a visual identity for Springfield that is internally cohesive and externally distinct. Springfield's people look like Springfield's people. They are recognizable as belonging to their place, the way that the architecture and the geography and the nuclear plant recognize them as belonging to Springfield. The yellow skin is not just a stylistic choice for individual characters. It is a visual marker of community membership. You can tell a Springfieldian from a non-Springfieldian by looking at their skin. And that has implications for how we understand the show's treatment of outsiders and insiders. When characters from outside Springfield visit the town, their relative visual difference, their more naturalistic proportions, their different color range, marks them as visitors. Not of this place, not shaped by this place, not carrying whatever Springfield has given its permanent residence in their skin and their biology and their proportions. The show has consistently depicted Springfield as a place that changes people. Not quickly, not dramatically, not in ways that any individual episode foregrounds. But the accumulation of living in Springfield, of drinking its water and breathing its air and existing within the influence of its dominant institution, does something to people. The show depicts this as a matter of visual fact. The residents look different because they are different, because something in Springfield has made them different. The yellow skin is not a stylistic quirk. It is the show's most efficient and most consistent piece of world building. Every single frame of every single episode demonstrates, without a word of dialogue, that the people of Springfield have been physically marked by the place they live. Now, let's take the yellow question in a direction that the show almost went but ultimately pulled back from. There are several episodes scattered across the show's run in which characters react to Simpsons family members in ways that suggest a recognition that they look unusual. Not dramatically, not with shock or alarm, but with a slight register of awareness that something about the people in front of them is different. These moments are usually framed as jokes. A visiting character will make a comment. A standardized testing administrator will note something about Bart's appearance. A television producer will remark on Homer's unusual physique. These reactions are played for laughs and then moved past without further examination. But they exist, and their existence is interesting, because they confirm something that the show's basic premise requires us to accept. Within the universe of the show, the Simpsons look unusual even to other characters. They are not simply the baseline of what a person looks like in this world. They are notable. Their appearance is, in some contexts, remarked upon. If they look unusual to other characters, then other characters can see what we, the audience, can see. They see the yellow skin and the four fingers, and the particular physiognomy that Springfield produces in its long-term residents. And for the most part, those other characters have chosen to say nothing, to accept the visual reality of Springfield's people without comment, to normalize what should not, by any real-world standard, be normal. This is the same social choice that the town makes over and over in other contexts. The fish with 3 eyes, the plant with 342 violations, the mayor who is openly corrupt, the police chief who is openly incompetent, the billionaire who is openly kept alive by weekly radiation treatments that make him glow in the dark. Springfield is a town of practiced non-comment, of deliberate acceptance, of a social agreement not to point at the obvious thing. The yellow skin fits perfectly into this pattern. It is the most obvious thing in Springfield, visible in every frame, impossible to miss, and never once directly acknowledged by any character within the show's universe. That is not naturalism. That is craft. The show has constructed a world in which the most glaring physical impossibility is treated with the most rigorous social silence, and that silence is maintained not because the characters cannot see the yellow, but because Springfield has agreed not to speak of it, which makes the yellow skin, in the end, not just a symptom, but a secret. The most openly kept secret in the history of television. Let's talk about what the yellow skin means for specific members of the Simpson family, because the color applies equally to everyone but does not mean the same thing for everyone. Homer's yellow skin is, in some ways, the most interesting. Homer has worked at the nuclear plant for the entirety of his adult life. He has been in direct proximity to radioactive material in a facility with 342 safety violations, including cracked cooling towers and luminous rats, for decades. His skin color, if you accept the environmental contamination theory, represents the accumulated effects of the longest, most intense radiation exposure of any Simpson family member. And yet Homer is also the most physically resilient character in the show. He has survived falls, explosions, electrocutions, animal attacks, and injuries that would be fatal to a real human being. His healing rate is extraordinary. His pain tolerance is superhuman. His physical durability, across hundreds of episodes, defies any plausible biological explanation. The radiation theory offers one. Homer's biology has been so thoroughly altered by decades of radiation exposure that it has adapted. The mutation that has turned his skin yellow has also, as a side effect, made him nearly indestructible. The same process that changed his color has changed his cellular structure in ways that allow him to absorb and recover from trauma at a rate no normal human body could manage. This is a dark thought. Homer's superhuman physical resilience is not a cartoon convenience. It is a symptom. He is indestructible because he is mutated. And the mutation that makes him indestructible is the same one that has cognitively devastated him and turned his skin the color of a warning sign. Homer is not funny because he is resilient. Homer is funny because the show has decided to frame as comedy what is, in any clinical reading, a picture of a man being slowly destroyed by his environment, physically transformed and cognitively diminished, and rendered incapable of understanding his own condition. The yellow is the flag. The body that won't die is the symptom, and the laugh track that accompanies Homer's falls and Homer's injuries and Homer's miraculous recoveries is the sound of Springfield's practiced non-comment applied to the most visible and most disturbing detail. Of all, Marge's yellow skin is complicated by her hair. Marge Simpson's hair is one of the show's most iconic visual elements, a tower of blue arranged in a vertical structure that defies gravity and physics and the basic properties of hair as a material. The hair has been a part of Marge's visual identity from the very beginning of the show. It is, in fan culture and in the broader cultural conversation about The Simpsons, the detail most associated with Marge as a character. What the show has revealed across various flashback episodes is that Marge's hair was not always blue. As a child, she had a different hair color, which the flashbacks have depicted inconsistently. The blue color, the tower structure, these developed. The show implies, though it never states directly, that Marge's hair became what it is over time, through some process or accumulation of circumstances that are never fully explained. Under the radiation theory, Marge's hair represents a mutation of keratin, the protein that makes up hair, produced by long-term exposure to Springfield's contaminated environment. The blue color is not natural. The vertical structure is not natural. The hair's apparent imperviousness to rain, wind, heat, and the basic forces of atmospheric physics is not natural. Marge's hair is a mutation, visible and dramatic and completely normalized by the people around her. Marge has worked at the Springfield nuclear power plant. Marge has spent her entire adult life in Springfield. Marge has been drinking Springfield's water and breathing Springfield's air since before her children were born. Her children's hair is also unusual. Bart's spiky structure, Lisa's five-pointed star shape, Maggie's single curl. None of these are natural hair configurations. None of them occur in real human populations. All three of them maintain their impossible shapes without product or effort, in all weather conditions, across decades of time. The hair is the most visible mutation in the Simpson family, and it has been growing since the first episode. There is a specific episode that approaches the yellow question more directly than the show has ever otherwise gone, and it is worth examining closely. The episode exists in the Treehouse of Horror anthology, which means it is officially non-canonical. But the Treehouse episodes have always had a peculiar relationship with the show's main continuity. They are officially outside it, but they are often more honest about the show's underlying premises than the canonical episodes are. They can say things the canonical show cannot, because the non-canon framing gives them permission. In the relevant Treehouse episode, Homer is exposed to radiation at the power plant and undergoes an explicit physical mutation. The episode treats this as a horror premise, as a sudden, dramatic transformation triggered by radiation exposure. Homer's mutation in this episode is grotesque and unmistakable, and treated by the narrative as a terrible thing that should not be happening. In the canonical show, Homer is also exposed to radiation at the power plant, daily, for decades. The mutation is slower, less dramatic, distributed across time rather than concentrated in a single incident, but the cause is the same. And the effect? The physical transformation produced by radiation exposure is the same. The Treehouse episode is not describing a fictional horror scenario. It is describing, in accelerated and exaggerated form, exactly what the canonical show has always been depicting in the background. The horror, in other words, was always there. The Treehouse just turned up the contrast. Springfield's yellow skin is 36 years of that horror, running at standard contrast, in every frame, never turned up, never addressed, never resolved. Just present. Just there. The most visible fact of a show that has always been more comfortable with buried facts than with surface ones. One final thought on the yellow question before we move on. There is a version of this analysis that is much simpler and much more emotionally available than the medical or the environmental or the philosophical versions. The Simpsons are yellow because yellow is the color of warmth, of sunlight, of the quality of light that falls on a summer afternoon, of egg yolks and daffodils and the inside of a lit lamp. Yellow is an inherently welcoming color, physiologically processed as positive by the human visual system, associated with openness and light and comfort. A family that is yellow is a family you want to spend time with. A family that draws you in with color before you've heard a single joke or registered a single plot point. A family that looks, in the most primal visual processing sense, like warmth. The Simpsons have drawn audiences for 36 years. Not just because of the jokes, not just because of the characters, not just because of the themes, also because of the yellow. Because the show figured out, in 1989, how to make a family that looked like a place you wanted to be. Which is the darkest version of the yellow question's answer. They made the family look warm so you would keep going back. So you would accept the buried horror as background noise behind a warm yellow glow. So the most visible symptom of everything wrong with Springfield would also be the thing that kept you coming back for more. And it worked. For 36 years, it has worked. Section 3. Every job Homer ever held, and what they say about Springfield's economy. Homer Simpson has held more jobs than almost any other recurring character in the history of American television. This is not an exaggeration. Across 36 seasons, Homer has been employed as a safety inspector, a snowplow driver, a food critic, a missionary, a monorail conductor, a bodyguard, an astronaut, a substitute teacher, a farmer, a country music manager, a paparazzo, a boxing promoter, a minister, an inventor, a beer baron, a clown, a voice actor, a professional gambler, a cartoonist, a Civil War reenactor, a firefighter, a small business owner multiple times over, a professional athlete in several sports, a truck driver, a hairstylist, a tour guide, and an employee of approximately 60 to 90 other enterprises, depending on how rigorously you count recurring gags versus full episode vocational storylines. The canonical number most often cited by fans and episode guides is around 60 distinct jobs, though some counts run higher. The exact number is less important than the pattern. Homer has been employed in roughly every sector of the American economy that exists within the show's geographic and social reach, and he has failed at nearly all of them. What this creates, over 36 years of viewing, is an economic portrait of Springfield that the show has never presented as such. Homer's serial employment and serial failure is meant to be funny, and it is funny, but it is also a systematic exploration of what the American working economy looks like at the level at which Homer operates. And what it looks like is not encouraging. Let's start with Homer's primary job, the one he always returns to, the one that provides the economic baseline for the Simpson family's life. Homer is the safety inspector in Sector 7G at the Springfield nuclear power plant. He has held this position for the entirety of the show's run, excepting the episodes in which he has temporarily left it for other employment. The job pays enough to support a 4-person family, including 3 children, in a 2-story home in what appears to be a stable, working-class neighborhood. The family has a car. They take occasional vacations. They eat out sometimes. They are, by the standards of American economic life, functional. This is striking because Homer is, by any objective measure, catastrophically bad at his job. His IQ, as stated by the show's creator in interviews and implied by various episodes, is 55. A standardized intelligence measure of 55 places a person in a range associated with significant cognitive disability. This is not a mean-spirited characterization. It is the show's own framing, explicitly stated and consistently maintained through Homer's behavior across hundreds of episodes. A man with an IQ of 55, in the real world, would not be employed as the safety inspector of a nuclear power plant. The position, in reality, requires extensive certification, ongoing education, demonstrated competence in nuclear safety protocols, and regular evaluation by oversight agencies. It is a position that, in any real nuclear facility, is occupied by someone with significant technical training and a demonstrated track record of safety compliance. Homer has caused more nuclear incidents than he has prevented. He sleeps at his workstation. He has introduced contaminants into the reactor. He has, famously, caused the near meltdown of the plant on multiple occasions. His employment file contains hundreds of documented errors, which the show has referenced multiple times as a running count of his catastrophic incompetence. And he has kept his job for 36 years. This is, on its surface, a joke. Of course, Homer keeps his job. He's the main character. The show needs him to have an income and a workplace. The continued employment is a narrative convenience. But the show itself has given an in-universe explanation for Homer's job security, and that explanation is more disturbing than any comedy rationale. As we discussed briefly in the previous section, there is canonical evidence that Grandpa Simpson made a deal with Mr. Burns at some point in the past. Burns had committed some unspecified crime, Grandpa discovered it, and in exchange for Grandpa's silence, Burns guaranteed Homer a job at the plant regardless of his performance. Homer's position is not maintained by competence. It is maintained by a private backroom agreement between his father and his employer that Homer himself is unaware of. This means that Homer's entire economic life, the income that supports his family, the paycheck that pays the mortgage on the house in which his children grow up, the financial foundation of the Simpson household, is built on a secret that was struck without Homer's knowledge or consent. Homer works at the plant because of a deal his father made, and Homer has no idea. This is the structure of Homer's economic life. He holds a job he cannot competently perform, in a facility whose dangers he is not equipped to understand, because of an arrangement made behind his back by a man who is now too old and too confused to explain it. And the arrangement was made by the same man who also concealed from Homer the fact that his mother was alive. The same man who sent Homer into the world with two of the most important facts of his life, the truth of his mother's survival and the basis of his employment, hidden from him. Grandpa Simpson has been a figure of comedy for 36 years. His long-winded stories, his confusing anecdotes, his inability to track a conversation, his spectacular incompetence as a father. But look at what Grandpa has actually done. He lied to his son about his mother's death. He made a private deal that determined his son's entire adult economic life. He concealed both of these things for decades while allowing Homer to live inside the lies without the information he would need to understand his own situation. Grandpa is not just a comedy character. Grandpa is the architect of Homer's ignorance. Homer's secondary jobs, the rotating cast of employments that have filled hundreds of episodes, are individually funny and collectively revealing. What they reveal, taken together, is the economic structure of Springfield and its relationship to the American economy more broadly. Homer's jobs span an enormous range of sectors, but they tend to cluster around a few consistent categories. Manual labor, small-scale entrepreneurship, low-level participation in industries that are dominated by larger forces, whether those forces are corporations, organized crime, or the specific economic eccentricity of Springfield's institutional landscape. Homer is rarely employed at a high level in any industry. His jobs are almost always at the point of contact between the worker and the work, rather than at the managerial or ownership level. He drives the snowplow rather than owning the snowplow company. He works on the food truck rather than running the food truck operation. He is the bodyguard rather than the person being guarded. He is the worker, always, positioned at the bottom of whatever economic structure the episode places him in. There are exceptions. Homer has briefly owned businesses. The Simpson home has been used as a bed and breakfast. Homer has been a small-scale manufacturer in the episode where he makes and sells Homer Loves Patty-style barbecue sauce. He has briefly operated within the informal economy of home production and sales that represents the lowest rung of American entrepreneurship. These ventures always fail. not because the ideas are necessarily bad, but because Homer cannot sustain the management and execution requirements of running a business, and because the economic environment of Springfield does not provide the kind of support infrastructure that small businesses require to survive. Springfield's economy is dominated by burns. The nuclear plant is the town's primary employer and economic anchor. Everything else in Springfield's economy orbits around the gravitational pull of that single institution. Small businesses exist in the margins, and margins in Springfield are precarious. The episode Homer versus Patty and Selma demonstrates this well. Homer, facing a cash crisis, borrows money from his sisters-in-law, who then leverage the debt for power over his domestic life. The cash crisis itself results from a failed investment, which results from a combination of Homer's impulsive decision-making and the volatility of whatever Springfield-specific economy he has accidentally placed money into. The episode is a comedy about domestic power dynamics, but underneath it is a picture of a working-class household with no financial cushion and no access to the kind of institutional support systems, credit, savings, investment infrastructure that would give a family like the Simpsons any resilience in the face of an economic setback. Homer's jobs are not random. They are the specific jobs available to someone at his economic and cognitive level in Springfield. They are the jobs that exist in the margins of a company town, the supplemental employment that a nuclear plant employee can pick up when the primary income proves insufficient, the side hustles and seasonal work and informal economy positions that fill in the gaps of a working-class income. And they are all, eventually, taken from him. By incompetence, by bad luck, by the indifference of larger economic forces that operate far above the level at which Homer is operating. Homer's serial unemployment is not just a character trait. It is an economic portrait. Let's go through some of Homer's most revealing jobs in detail. The astronaut. In the episode Deep Space Homer, Homer is selected by NASA to go to space. This is one of the most celebrated episodes in the show's history, and is also one of the most economically telling. NASA selects Homer not because of his qualifications, but because they need a ratings boost. They need the space program to attract public attention, and they have determined that an average, relatable, working-class man in space will be more engaging to the general public than a conventional, highly qualified astronaut. Homer is chosen for the explicit purpose of being unremarkable. His qualifications are his lack of qualifications. He is cast as the anti-astronaut, the kind of person nobody expects to go to space, which is precisely why NASA wants him. The PR value of Homer Simpson in orbit exceeds the safety value of having a competent person at the controls. This is a very specific economic observation. Homer's value to NASA is his ordinariness, his marketability as a symbol of common experience. And NASA is willing to accept the risk of sending a man with an IQ of 55 into space aboard an expensive and complex spacecraft because the PR value of doing so is higher than the safety cost. This is not a fantasy. This is a recognizable logic. The entertainment economy's capacity to override the safety concerns of other industries. The willingness to accept elevated risk when the reward is increased visibility. The specific way in which ordinary people are commodified, turned into content, used as symbols of relatable humanity for the benefit of institutions that are not, themselves, particularly interested in ordinary people except as raw material for marketing. Homer goes to space and nearly destroys the spacecraft and is celebrated as a hero because the footage was compelling. The outcome of the mission does not change the PR calculus. The content was generated. The ratings came in. Homer is a success because the measure of success in this context is not safety or achievement but attention. The food critic. Homer's brief career as a food critic for the Springfield Shopper is economically interesting because it represents a version of what we now call influencer culture, deployed at the level of a mid-sized American city's local newspaper. Homer receives free food in exchange for producing opinions about that food. His opinions are not necessarily accurate or sophisticated, but they carry weight because they appear in print, because print confers authority, and because the restaurants of Springfield need that authority to generate business. Homer's influence as a food critic is disproportionate to his actual culinary knowledge because the system in which he operates rewards presence over quality. He has the column, he has the platform. The restaurants need the coverage. Homer has economic power in this situation not because of what he knows or does, but because of where he sits in the information ecosystem. When Homer is eventually replaced as the food critic by a more qualified reviewer, the loss of his position is treated as a personal setback. But economically, what has happened is that the platform has found a more efficient use of itself. The system has moved on from Homer to someone who delivers more reliable value to the information ecosystem, which is what systems do. Homer's tenure as a food critic is always temporary, because his tenure in any position that involves the exercise of cultural authority is temporary. He can access that authority briefly, when the system creates an opening for him, but he cannot sustain it, because he does not have the underlying qualifications that would make him a durable occupant of any position that involves knowledge or taste or sustained expertise. The Beer Baron. During a Prohibition-era episode, Homer becomes a bootleg beer manufacturer. This job is economically interesting because it sits entirely outside the formal economy and operates instead through the informal economy of criminal enterprise. Homer discovers that he can manufacture beer at home for a fraction of the cost of purchasing it legally, and that the artificial scarcity created by prohibition creates a demand he can serve. This is a portrait of how working-class people historically responded to economic exclusion. When formal economic opportunities are closed off, whether by law, by corporate monopoly, or by the structural inaccessibility of legitimate market entry, people create informal markets. Homer's beer manufacturing is a form of entrepreneurship that the formal economy would not permit him, but the informal economy enables. He has the skills, the equipment, and the demand. The only thing preventing him from operating is the law, and the law in Springfield is enforced with such spectacular incompetence that it poses a minimal deterrent. The episode is a comedy, but the underlying economic logic is real. And the fact that Homer excels at this particular enterprise, that he is good at beer making in a way that he is not good at his legitimate job, suggests something about the relationship between Springfield's official economy and its unofficial one. The formal economy gives Homer a job he cannot do competently. The informal economy gives him work he can do well. The formal economy is the one that has official sanction. The informal one is the one he's actually suited for. The farmer. Homer briefly becomes a farmer, inheriting or acquiring agricultural land and attempting to work it. The farming episode is a portrait of what happens when someone with no agricultural knowledge encounters the economic realities of American farming. It is brutal terrain even for experienced farmers. For Homer, it is predictably catastrophic, and the episode ends with the land being sold or lost and Homer returning to the plant. But the farming episode is worth noting for what it shows about the economic backstory of Springfield. There is farmland near Springfield. There is agricultural economy adjacent to the town's industrial economy. Springfield exists in a zone where industrial and agricultural economic modes are close enough to interact, which places it in the tradition of a specific kind of American settlement, the industrial town that grew up on or near agricultural land, that exists in tension with its rural surroundings, that has an ambivalent relationship with the rural economy that preceded it and was displaced by it. The plant and the farm, in Springfield, are in the same ecosystem. Homer moves between them without transition because there is no real transition to make. They are different expressions of the same underlying economic reality, a working-class man trying to earn a living in a landscape that is not designed to make that easy. What does the sum of Homer's employment history tell us about Springfield's economy? First, it tells us that Springfield's economy is extremely volatile at the working-class level. Jobs appear and disappear. Industries boom and collapse within the span of a single episode. The economic landscape is unstable enough that someone in Homer's position can plausibly be employed in dozens of different sectors across a lifetime. Second, it tells us that the dominant institution in Springfield's economy, the nuclear plant, is the only thing providing genuine stability. Homer always comes back to the plant not because the plant is a good employer, but because it is the only employer in Springfield that offers anything resembling security. The deal between Grandpa and Burns guarantees Homer's position there. Everything else is subject to the normal volatility of Springfield's economic landscape. Third, it tells us that upward mobility in Springfield is essentially fictional. Homer's jobs span an enormous range of industries, but they do not form a career trajectory. There is no arc of increasing skill, increasing responsibility, increasing compensation. There is just motion, lateral motion, the same economic level approached from different angles across different episodes. Homer is never building toward anything. He is maintaining, barely, the position he started from. This is the economic portrait of Springfield that the show has been painting for 36 years. A town where the working class is held in place, where the primary employer offers security at the cost of exploitation and danger, where alternative employment is available but unstable, where the informal economy is accessible but illegal, where the formal institutions of support, education, training, social services are dysfunctional enough to provide no real ladder for anyone trying to climb out of their economic position. Springfield is not just a funny town. Springfield is a town where economic mobility is structurally prevented, and Homer's 60-plus jobs are the clearest possible evidence of that structural prevention. He keeps trying different things. He keeps failing or being removed from them. He keeps coming back to Sector 7G, not because he wants to, because that is where Springfield has decided he belongs. And the crayon in his brain, the radiation from the plant, the deal his father made, the lies about his mother, all of it conspired to make sure he would never have the cognitive tools or the emotional resources or the structural support to end up anywhere else. Burns didn't need to trap Homer. He just needed to ensure that the trap was already built when Homer arrived. Let's look at the economic lives of the people around Homer, because Springfield's economic portrait extends well beyond the Simpson household. Moe Sislak owns Moe's Tavern. This is, on paper, a small business success story. Moe has operated a bar in Springfield for the entirety of the show's run. He has a regular clientele. He has, presumably, kept the lights on and the beer cold through whatever economic fluctuations Springfield has experienced. But the details of Moe's economic situation are considerably darker than the surface suggests. Moe's Tavern is not a thriving business. It is a barely surviving one. The clientele is small and loyal, precisely because they are too economically and socially precarious to go elsewhere. Barney Gumble, the bar's most devoted patron, has spent the majority of his adult life on a bar stool because he has nowhere else to go and nothing else to spend his money on. The bar is not serving a healthy community's social needs. It is serving the social needs of people who have fallen out of the community's formal social structures. Moe himself is economically desperate in ways the show depicts honestly. He has attempted to close the bar and reinvent it in various ways. He has pursued other enterprises. He has tried, periodically, to get out from under the weight of running a business that exists at the very bottom of Springfield's economic ecosystem, serving the least economically stable members of an already unstable working-class community. He always fails. He always comes back. Moe's Tavern persists not because it is economically viable, but because it fills a social function that Springfield's formal institutions do not provide. It is a place where men with nowhere else to go can spend their evenings. And in a town with Springfield's particular combination of isolation, dysfunction, and managed cognitive decline, there will always be men with nowhere else to go. The convenience store owned by Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon is another window into Springfield's economic life. Apu's Quick E-Mart is one of the show's most constant locations, and Apu himself is one of the longest-running supporting characters. The Quick E-Mart is a franchise operation which places Apu in a specific economic position. He is not an independent business owner. He is a franchisee, which means he has invested significant capital in a business model designed by and for the benefit of the parent company, and he operates within the terms and constraints set by that company. The show has depicted, across multiple episodes, the specific pressures of Apu's economic situation. He works extremely long hours, legendarily long hours, the kind of hours that suggest a business operating on margins so thin that every hour without the owner present is an hour that could tip the business into loss. He has a family to support. He has ongoing obligations to the franchise corporation. He is caught between the demands of his employer above and the demands of his family below, with not enough resources to comfortably satisfy either. This is not a cartoon situation. This is the economic reality of American franchising, depicted with reasonable accuracy through the specific lens of Springfield's exaggerated landscape. Apu's economic life is hard because the franchise model is designed to extract maximum value from the franchisee while transferring the risk of operation entirely to the franchisee rather than to the parent company. The Quick E-Mart makes money. The question is who it makes money for, and in what proportion. Lenny Leonard and Carl Carlson, Homer's closest friends at the plant, deserve a moment of economic attention. Lenny and Carl are, in many respects, the most under-examined characters in the show's main cast. They have been Homer's coworkers since the beginning of the show. They are present in nearly every plant-based episode. They are Homer's closest social peers, the people with whom he spends most of his working life. And they are almost entirely mysterious. What do we know about Lenny and Carl's economic lives outside the plant? Very little. They drink at Moe's. They attend Springfield events. They respond to Homer's various crises with the loyal support of true friends. But the details of their domestic lives, their housing situations, their economic circumstances, their trajectories, all of this is vague enough to suggest that the show is deliberately not developing it. This is interesting because Lenny and Carl, as safety plant workers alongside Homer, presumably earn similar wages. They presumably have similar economic lives. And yet the show has never positioned them as struggling in the way Homer struggles. They do not have families to support, at least not families the show depicts. They appear to have more disposable income and more personal freedom than Homer does. But they are still there. In the plant, in Moe's, in Springfield. Still, after 36 years, at the same positions they occupied at the beginning. Still Homer's friends, still showing up, still loyal. The loyalty of Lenny and Carl to Homer and to Springfield is one of the show's most quietly moving details. These are not men who are trapped, or if they are trapped, they have made their peace with it in a way that Homer, for all his cognitive limitation, has never quite managed. Homer always seems to be fighting against his circumstances, even when he doesn't understand what his circumstances are. Lenny and Carl seem to have settled into theirs. They have found in Springfield's limited landscape enough of what they need, or enough of what they've accepted, to remain without visible distress. What this means for Springfield's economic portrait is this: the plant is not just an employer, it is a community. It creates relationships and social bonds and a sense of belonging that, for many of its employees, is more valuable than any wage increase or career advancement could be. Lenny and Carl don't leave the plant because the plant is where they have each other, and Homer and the regularity of work that gives their days a structure they might not find elsewhere. Burns has not just created an employer, he has created a community of mutual dependence. And communities of mutual dependence, in company towns, are the most durable forms of social control that capitalism has ever devised. The workers don't leave because they have nowhere else to go that offers what they already have here, and they don't revolt because revolting would mean losing the only community they know. This is Springfield's economy in its deepest expression. Not a market, a system. And the system works perfectly for the person it is designed to work for. Section 4. The Springfield Underworld Crime, Corruption, and Fat Tony's Shadow Government. Springfield has a functioning organized crime infrastructure. This is not a detail the show treats as background or incidental. The mob is a regular part of Springfield's social landscape, with its own recurring characters, its own institutional logic, and its own relationship to the town's official power structure that is far more intertwined than most fans have fully processed. The central figure of Springfield's criminal underground is Fat Tony, whose full name has been given as Marion Anthony D'Amico. Fat Tony is the head of the Springfield mob, and he operates with a confidence and a visibility that suggests he is not particularly worried about law enforcement. He is not hiding. He attends local events. He has relationships with Springfield's legitimate civic figures. He is, in a very real sense, a part of the community. This should be alarming. The fact that it is not within the show's universe, treated as alarming, is itself one of the show's most consistent and most carefully maintained observations about the relationship between organized crime and legitimate civic power in American communities. Let's start with what the Springfield mob actually does. The organization that Fat Tony runs has been depicted as involved in a wide range of criminal enterprises across the show's run. The most consistently referenced is the legitimate business front model, in which criminal enterprises operate behind the cover of legal businesses. Fat Tony has controlled or been associated with various food-related businesses, waste management, construction, and the general infrastructure maintenance industries that have historically been associated with organized crime in the real world. These are not random choices. The show has drawn, quite deliberately, on the historical reality of American organized crime's relationship to specific industries. Waste management and construction in particular have real historical associations with organized crime in American cities, and the show uses these associations as a basis for depicting Fat Tony's economic operations in Springfield. But the most interesting aspect of Fat Tony's criminal enterprise is not what it does. It is how it relates to Springfield's official power structure. Chief Clancy Wiggum, Springfield's chief of police, has been depicted in his relationship to Fat Tony across many episodes, and the picture that emerges is not one of law enforcement opposing criminal enterprise. It is one of accommodation, mutual benefit, and carefully maintained coexistence. Wiggum is not depicted as being on Fat Tony's payroll in the explicit, dramatic way of film noir. The show is subtler than that, and the subtlety is more interesting. Wiggum and Fat Tony seem to have reached an understanding, an arrangement in which the criminal enterprise operates with a certain degree of freedom, and in which law enforcement looks where the arrangement directs it to look and not where it does not. This arrangement is depicted as deeply normalized. Wiggum does not seem to experience any moral conflict about it. Fat Tony does not seem to spend any energy managing or concealing the arrangement. They coexist in a way that suggests the accommodation has been in place for long enough to have become simply how things work in Springfield. This is a very specific and very accurate picture of how organized crime historically embeds itself in communities. Not through violence and terror, though those tools are available and sometimes used. Through accommodation, through finding the right arrangement with the right officials at the right price. Through becoming so woven into the community's economic and social fabric that eliminating the criminal enterprise would require unraveling something much larger than the crime itself. Springfield's mob is not a foreign presence. It is a local institution. And like the nuclear plant, and like Mayor Quimby's political machine, and like the police department's institutional culture of incompetence and self-service, the mob is part of the infrastructure that makes Springfield function. Mayor Quimby is the political dimension of Springfield's shadow government, and he is one of the most carefully observed satirical portraits in the show's history. Mayor Diamond Joe Quimby is transparently corrupt. His corruption is not a hidden subplot. It is a running gag that the show has maintained for 36 years. He awards city contracts based on personal relationships. He uses public funds for personal enrichment. He is susceptible to bribery, flattery, and the threat of political embarrassment. He is, in most decisions that matter, available to the highest bidder, and Springfield re-elects him, apparently, indefinitely. This is the show's most direct and most durable political observation. Not that politicians are corrupt, that's a commonplace. The observation that is specific and precise and more interesting is that a community can know, with full clarity, that its political leadership is corrupt and can continue to elect that leadership anyway. Not out of ignorance, out of a kind of resigned acceptance that this is how it works, and the alternatives are either unavailable or worse. Quimby has been challenged in elections across the show's run. He has faced opponents who are more competent, more honest, and more genuinely interested in serving the public. He defeats them or outlasts them through a combination of name recognition, incumbent advantage, the support of institutional players who benefit from his corruptibility, and the fundamental passivity of a Springfield electorate that has been told, through 36 years of institutional dysfunction, that their participation does not change outcomes. A population that has been taught, through consistent experience, that civic participation does not produce meaningful change is a population that stops participating meaningfully. They show up, they vote, they might even vote for the better candidate occasionally, but they do not sustain the kind of ongoing civic engagement that would be necessary to hold an entrenched corrupt official accountable over time. Because the effort required to maintain that engagement against the institutional weight of a Quimby political machine is more than a population with Homer Simpson's cognitive resources and Ned Flanders's behavioral conditioning, and Springfield's systematically managed dysfunction, can reliably produce. The Quimby machine and the Burns empire operate in alignment. Burns does not need to directly control the city government. He needs the city government to remain dysfunctional enough that it cannot effectively challenge or regulate his plant's operations. Quimby's corruption serves that need. A competent, ethical city government would apply genuine regulatory pressure to the plant, would investigate the environmental violations, would pursue the 342 safety issues that the surprise inspection identified. Quimby's government will not do any of these things, because Quimby's government is too busy managing its own corruption to pursue anyone else's. This is not a cynical fantasy. This is a description of how captured regulatory environments actually work. The corruption does not need to be coordinated, it just needs to be aligned. Burns and Quimby do not need to have explicit conversations about protecting the plant from regulation. They just need to have the same interests in maintaining the status quo, and to be the two most powerful institutional actors in Springfield's limited political ecosystem. Let's talk about Fat Tony's specific role in Springfield's civic life, because it goes beyond what the show treats as obvious. In multiple episodes, Fat Tony has been depicted as providing services to Springfield that the official civic infrastructure cannot or will not provide. When Homer needs something done that falls outside the official channels, Fat Tony is sometimes the resource. When the community needs a problem solved that official institutions have failed to solve, the mob's capacity for direct action becomes available as an alternative. This is a pattern that has real historical precedent. In communities where official institutions have failed or been captured by competing interests, informal power structures, including criminal ones, sometimes fill the gap. They provide services, enforce informal contracts, maintain a kind of order, and generate loyalty in the process. The loyalty is complicated because it comes with obligations and vulnerabilities that legitimate civic institutions would not impose. But in a community that has no functional relationship with its legitimate institutions, complicated loyalty is better than the absence of support. Springfield's mob is, in this reading, a symptom of the same institutional failure that produces Wigham's police department and Quimby's government. In a functional civic society, the mob's services would not be needed because the official institutions would be providing them. In Springfield, the official institutions have failed often enough and thoroughly enough that the mob's informal authority has found a genuine demand. This is perhaps the darkest civic detail in the show's background. Not that organized crime exists in Springfield, but that it exists because of a vacuum created by the failure of legitimate institutions, and that vacuum was itself created by a system designed to keep the population passive and the institutions captured. The mob did not corrupt Springfield. Springfield was already corrupted when the mob arrived. The mob just noticed the opening. There is a specific episode that explores Springfield's relationship to organized crime with more depth and more honesty than most, and it involves Lisa Simpson in a way that illuminates both the character and the show's broader political consciousness. In the episode, Lisa investigates an area of Springfield's civic life and discovers connections between legitimate institutions and criminal enterprises that the community has chosen not to see. Her investigation threatens to expose the arrangement, and she encounters resistance not just from the criminal side, but from the legitimate institutions, whose stability depends on the arrangement remaining in place. The episode ends, as most Lisa episodes that challenge Springfield's institutional arrangements end, without resolution. The truth is inconvenient. The institutions are protective of their arrangements. The community is not ready to deal with what a genuine exposure of the truth would require them to deal with. And Lisa, brilliant and principled and determined, hits the same wall she always hits, a Springfield that will not look at itself clearly. But the episode's lasting contribution is what it shows about the relationship between knowledge and power in Springfield. Lisa has the information. She knows the truth. And knowing the truth is not enough, has never been enough, will never be enough in Springfield, because truth in Springfield operates in an environment in which the institutional capacity to act on truth has been systematically degraded. You can know that the plant is poisoning the water. You can know that the mayor is corrupt. You can know that the police chief accommodates the mob. You can know all of this with perfect clarity. And in Springfield, knowing does not produce action, because the mechanisms through which knowledge would normally lead to action, journalism, civic institutions, legal recourse, political pressure, have been either captured or disabled by the same system that produced the problems you now know about. Lisa knows. And knowing leaves her exactly where she started. Alone, in Springfield, with the truth. Let me slow down here and let the room breathe for a moment. These are heavy ideas, and they deserve some space. The connection between organized crime and institutional failure. The way corrupt systems protect themselves by disabling the mechanisms that could challenge them. The loneliness of being the person in the room who sees clearly in a community that has decided not to. All of this is in The Simpsons. All of it has been in The Simpsons for 36 years. In the background of episodes that are also about Homer getting a new job, or Bart playing a prank, or Lisa entering a competition, the darkness does not displace the comedy. It runs beneath it, like the river that runs near the nuclear plant, carrying something through the town that most of the residents have decided not to look too closely at. There is something almost comforting about that structure, if you let yourself settle into it. The comedy is real. The characters are genuinely funny and genuinely warm. The love in the Simpson family is genuine, strange, and expressed imperfectly but genuine. And underneath that love, underneath those laughs, something true and dark and carefully observed runs on and on. Just like this night. The intersection of organized crime and legitimate business in Springfield is most visible in the waste management industry, and the waste management industry's relationship to the nuclear plant is one of the show's most consistently dark background details. The nuclear plant produces radioactive waste. This is established, unavoidable, and a matter of scientific fact about how nuclear power generation works. Radioactive waste requires disposal, and the disposal of radioactive waste is one of the most highly regulated areas of environmental law in the United States. Springfield's nuclear plant does not appear to be particularly careful about its waste disposal. The show has depicted radioactive waste from the plant being stored in drums that are visibly corroded and leaking. It has depicted waste being dumped in bodies of water. It has depicted waste being left in places where children can encounter it. The show treats these disposal failures as jokes, as background elements, as the kind of thing that is funny precisely because it is so egregiously wrong. But waste disposal is also an area where organized crime has historically operated. Illegal waste dumping, particularly the disposal of industrial and hazardous waste outside of the regulated channels, is a service that criminal enterprises have provided to industries that want to avoid the cost and regulatory burden of legal disposal. The criminal enterprise provides a disposal service at below-market rates by eliminating the regulatory compliance costs that make legal disposal expensive, and the waste ends up somewhere it should not. In Springfield, the waste from the nuclear plant ends up in the river, in playgrounds, in the environment generally, and the mob in Springfield is associated with waste management. These two facts exist within the same show, in the same fictional universe, and the show has never explicitly connected them. But the connection does not need to be explicit to be present. Springfield's mob is in waste management. Springfield's nuclear plant has a waste disposal problem. In a town where all institutions are aligned toward maintaining the status quo and minimizing the cost of doing business for the most powerful actors, the connection between those two facts does not require a smoking gun. It just requires a Springfield. A place where the obvious question goes unasked, because the people who would normally ask it have learned, through long experience, that asking changes nothing. Fat Tony's most interesting characteristic, as a character, is not his criminal authority, it is his domesticity. Fat Tony, across multiple episodes, is depicted as a loving father, a man who takes genuine interest in his son's development and education, who attends school events, who shows up for the ordinary parental obligations that the show associates with caring about one's children. He is also depicted as someone who has certain social graces, who is courteous in his personal interactions, who can engage with the community on the community's own terms. This creates a specific kind of cognitive dissonance that the show exploits for comedy, but that also functions as something more serious. Fat Tony is, in the context of his family and his personal relationships, recognizably human. He has the same parental anxieties, the same desire for his children to do better than he did, the same capacity for warmth and social connection that any Springfield parent has. And he is also the head of a criminal enterprise that exploits, threatens, and operates through the same community where he is raising his children. The show does not resolve this dissonance. It holds it, the way it holds most of its irresolvable dissonances, and uses it to illuminate something about the complexity of human beings and the communities they create. People who do terrible things are not monsters. They are people. They have families. They go to their children's school events. They have warmth and social grace, and the capacity for genuine connection. This is not an exculpation of Fat Tony's criminal activities. It is an observation about how people manage to live inside the contradiction between their self-image as decent people and their behavior as actors in institutional systems that cause harm. The mob does not think of itself as evil. The mob thinks of itself as a business, an alternative institution, a pragmatic response to a world that was not designed to give them the opportunities available to people born into legitimate power structures. This is how all of Springfield's institutional actors think of themselves. Burns thinks of himself as a businessman. Quimby thinks of himself as a politician. Wiggum thinks of himself as a law enforcement officer. Fat Tony thinks of himself as a community figure who happens to operate in certain informal economic channels. None of them think of themselves as the bad guy, and that is the scariest thing about all of them. There is one more dimension of Springfield's criminal landscape worth exploring before we move on, and it involves a character who sits at the intersection of criminality and celebrity in a way that the show has developed more carefully than most fans realize. Sideshow Bob, whose given name is Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr., is simultaneously Springfield's most sophisticated criminal and its most eloquent social critic. His crimes have been numerous and varied. His attempts to murder Bart Simpson are legendarily persistent. He has committed fraud, political assassination attempts, conspiracy, and various other felonies with a consistency that places him among the most dedicated criminal operatives in fiction. And he was, before his criminal career, a beloved children's television entertainer. The contrast is the point. Bob is a man of enormous intelligence and genuine cultural cultivation who has been pushed, by a specific sequence of events and humiliations, toward violence. His arc is a portrait of what happens when a person of exceptional capacity encounters a world that consistently refuses to take that capacity seriously, that humiliates and sidelines and reduces him, until the only channel left for his considerable energies is criminal. But we will give Sideshow Bob the section he deserves later in this script. For now, it's enough to note that his presence in Springfield's criminal landscape adds a dimension of tragedy to what would otherwise be a straightforwardly comic portrait of organized crime in an American small city. Springfield's criminal infrastructure is not just corrupt, it is sad. It is populated by people who, in various ways and for various reasons, have ended up in the margins of a system that could not accommodate them in its official structures, and have built their own structures in the spaces the official ones left empty. That is the truest thing the show has ever said about organized crime, and it has said it quietly in the background for 36 years. Section 5. The School That Fails on Purpose. Springfield Elementary's Buried Secrets. Springfield Elementary School has been the site of more individual plotlines than any location in the show's universe except perhaps the Simpson household itself. It is where Bart goes to fail, where Lisa goes to succeed and be punished for succeeding, where Principal Skinner goes to perform authority without possessing it, where groundskeeper Willie goes to maintain grounds that are always somehow worse than the maintenance applied to them, where lunch lady Doris prepares food that has never, in 36 seasons, been described as satisfying or nutritious by anyone who has consumed it. The school is, on its surface, a recognizable American public school of the kind that exists in working-class communities across the country. Underfunded, overcrowded, staffed by people who range from the deeply committed to the terminally disengaged, producing graduates who are, by the standards of the wider educational system, inconsistently prepared for the lives that await them. But Springfield Elementary is also something more specific than a generic portrait of American public education. It is a portrait of a school that has been systematically denied the resources it needs, and the denial has been so sustained and so thorough that the school has developed its own internal culture of managed failure. Let's start with the funding. The first mention of Springfield Elementary's financial situation that rises to the level of a real plot point comes in the Who Shot Mr. Burns storyline, when Burns' drilling operation beneath the school destroys the school's oil well and eliminates what would have been a significant source of independent funding for the school. This is the inciting incident of the Who Shot Mr. Burns storyline, and it is economically precise. The school had a resource. Burns took it. The school was left with nothing, as it was before the oil well was discovered. But now it had the additional psychological damage of having glimpsed what might have been possible before it was taken away. This is a very specific kind of economic harm. It is worse in some ways than never having had the resource at all. Having the resource briefly and losing it is a portrait of thwarted potential that the show uses deliberately. Springfield Elementary almost had what it needed. Burns made sure it didn't. Superintendent Chalmers, who oversees the Springfield School District from a position of bureaucratic authority that he exercises with the consistency of a man who has entirely given up, is one of the show's most carefully observed satirical portraits. Chalmers is not depicted as a bad person. He is not depicted as corrupt in the way that Quimby is corrupt, using his position for personal gain at the community's expense. Chalmers is depicted as something arguably worse, a bureaucrat who has internalized the dysfunction of the system he oversees to the point where his responses to institutional failure are themselves institutionalized. Chalmers' relationship with Principal Skinner is the show's most detailed portrait of bureaucratic dysfunction. Skinner, who is actually Armin Tamzarian, a detail we will not go deeper into here, as it was covered in the source material, is a principal who is not what he claims to be, in more ways than just the identity fraud. He is a principal who performs principalhood, who produces the surface behaviors and characteristics that a principal is supposed to produce, the suits, the interactions with Chalmers, the management of staff and students, without producing the underlying outcomes that principalhood is supposed to generate. Chalmers knows this. The show has made clear, across many episodes, that Chalmers is not actually deceived by Skinner's performance. He has seen enough of Springfield Elementary's outcomes to know that the school is not performing at the level that Skinner's principal performance would imply. He has enough institutional knowledge to understand that what he is observing in his visits to the school is theater rather than education. And he keeps coming back. He keeps attending Skinner's performances. He keeps accepting the theater. He keeps filing whatever reports he files and returning to the bureaucratic machinery that produced this situation in the first place, because the bureaucratic machinery does not have a mechanism for dealing with what Springfield Elementary actually is. The bureaucracy can process improvement. It can document failure. It can generate reports and trigger interventions and initiate oversight procedures. What it cannot do is address a school whose failure has become so normalized, so thoroughly institutionalized, so completely accepted as simply how things are in this particular corner of the educational system, that improvement would require dismantling and rebuilding the institution rather than reforming it from within. Chalmers knows this, Skinner probably knows this on some level, and they continue the performance of oversight and accountability because the alternative, acknowledging that the system has failed in a way that the system cannot fix, is not something either of them has the institutional authority, or possibly the emotional resources, to do. This is educational bureaucracy depicted with real precision. The show has not caricatured it into a monster. It has depicted it as something more accurate and more troubling. A system that is too large and too institutionalized to respond effectively to the specific failures of its specific components, staffed by people who are individually neither evil nor especially incompetent, producing outcomes that are systematically bad. The children of Springfield Elementary are an important part of this picture, and the show has always used them to make observations about childhood and education that it cannot make through its adult characters. Bart Simpson, the show's original protagonist, is Springfield Elementary's most famous student, and Bart's academic failure is one of the show's most carefully constructed ongoing narratives. Bart is not stupid. This is a point the show has made explicitly, multiple times, in ways that are easy to miss because they are surrounded by Bart's behavior, which is consistently disruptive, irresponsible, and academically non-compliant in ways that look, from a certain angle, like stupidity. But Bart is clever. Bart is resourceful. Bart's capacity for creative problem-solving, when applied to anything other than the academic curriculum Springfield Elementary is trying to deliver to him, is genuinely impressive. He is a social entrepreneur. He understands human behavior intuitively and uses that understanding to manipulate situations to his advantage. He has, in multiple episodes, demonstrated the capacity to learn and perform at a high level when the learning is connected to something he cares about. What Bart is failing is not education in the general sense. He is failing the specific form of education that Springfield Elementary provides, which is an education designed to produce compliant, grade-appropriate students who meet standardized benchmarks within the constraints of an underfunded, overcrowded, demoralized school system. Bart's relationship with this educational apparatus is adversarial, not because he is anti-intellectual, but because the apparatus is not offering him anything that connects to what he actually is. Springfield Elementary's curriculum, as depicted across hundreds of episodes, is rote, uninspiring, delivered by teachers who range from the competent but exhausted to the genuinely and spectacularly terrible. The school does not meet Bart where he is. It offers him a one-size approach to education, and Bart does not fit the size. The show has depicted this as Bart's failure. The grades, the behavioral record, the threat of being held back, all of these are framed as Bart's problem, Bart's fault, the consequence of Bart's choices and Bart's character. The school system's failure to engage him is not presented within the show's narrative framing as a failure of the system. It is presented as a failure of the student. This is an observation about how educational systems tend to locate failure. The student who is failing the system is described as a student who is failing, full stop. The possibility that the system itself might be failing the student is not typically available within the official discourse of school accountability as the show depicts it. But the show itself, through its consistent portrayal of Springfield Elementary's inadequacy, implicitly makes a different argument. Bart is not failing education. He is failing this education, in this school, in this town. And this school, in this town, is a specific product of specific choices and specific resource decisions and specific institutional arrangements that have produced a particular kind of educational environment that is bad at serving students like Bart. The crayon in Homer's brain is a metaphor for what the radiation does to intelligence. Bart's academic failure might be a metaphor for what a failed school system does to potential. Different mechanisms, same result. The same town producing the same outcome through different means. Lisa's experience at Springfield Elementary is the mirror of Bart's, and it is in some ways the darker of the two. Bart fails the school. Lisa succeeds at the school in every measurable way, and the school fails her in return. Lisa is a genius. The show has been consistent about this across 36 seasons. Her intelligence is not a detail that gets revised or complicated or walked back. She is, by any standard the show applies, far more intelligent than anyone around her, including the adults who are supposed to be educating and guiding her. She plays the saxophone with genuine musical ability. She reads voraciously, across disciplines, at a level far beyond her grade. She thinks rigorously and analytically about problems that other characters address through intuition or habit. She is, within the logic of Springfield, a genuinely exceptional mind. And Springfield Elementary has nothing to offer her. The show depicts this with consistent, quiet brutality. Lisa's academic excellence earns her recognition within the school system, but recognition without genuine intellectual challenge is a hollow reward. She wins the Student of the Month. She earns the good grades. She receives the positive reinforcement of a system that is designed to reward compliance with its standards, and none of it satisfies her because none of it challenges her. The teachers at Springfield Elementary are not equipped to teach Lisa. The school's curriculum does not reach her level. The resources that would allow a genuinely exceptional student to be appropriately challenged, advanced coursework, intellectual mentorship, access to the kind of educational opportunities that exceptional students in better-funded schools might receive, are not available at Springfield Elementary because Springfield Elementary does not have the resources to provide them. Lisa is a student who would thrive in a different environment. The show has depicted this explicitly in episodes where she encounters different educational settings, where she is briefly taught by a genuinely exceptional teacher, where she visits institutions that have the resources and the vision to engage students at her level. In each of these encounters, the show depicts Lisa as visibly, dramatically happier, more alive, more herself, and then the episode ends and she goes back to Springfield Elementary because Springfield Elementary is where she lives. Because the geographic and economic reality of the Simpson family does not provide access to the educational alternatives that Lisa's intelligence makes available in theory. Lisa's tragedy is not that she is too smart for Springfield. It is that Springfield's failure to accommodate her intelligence is a direct consequence of the same resource deprivation, the same institutional dysfunction, the same deliberate underfunding that produces Bart's academic failure. Different students, different learning profiles, same broken system producing different forms of educational harm. Let's talk about the teachers. Springfield Elementary's teaching staff is one of the show's most consistently observed satirical targets. The faculty ranges from the spectacularly incompetent to the quietly committed to the thoroughly disengaged, with the distribution weighted heavily toward the latter two categories. Mrs. Edna Krabappel, who teaches Bart's class, is the show's most detailed teacher portrait. She is a woman of genuine intelligence and, at some point in her past, genuine educational idealism. The show has given her enough backstory and enough depth over the years to make clear that she did not always approach her profession with the defeated cynicism that characterizes her relationship with Bart and his classmates. What happened to Edna Krabappel is what happens to many teachers who enter the profession with idealism and spend years working in an environment that systematically defeats it. The underfunding, the bureaucratic constraints, the administrative priorities that have nothing to do with learning. The students who come to school already damaged by circumstances outside the school's control. The parents who are too overwhelmed or too absent to provide the home support that would make the school's job easier. The administration that demands results while providing inadequate resources and support for producing them. Edna's cynicism is not a character flaw, it is a professional injury. She has been damaged by years of working in a system that did not support her or her students, and the damage has expressed itself as a defensive disengagement from the idealism that brought her to teaching in the first place. The show treats this as comedy. Mrs. Krabappel's disappointment is a running gag. Her romantic misadventures, her barely concealed contempt for her students' academic prospects, her willingness to cut corners on the educational experience in ways that serve her own convenience, all of these are played for laughs. But beneath the comedy is a portrait of what educational burnout looks like, what it produces in a teacher, and what it costs the students in her classroom. Bart and Mrs. Krabappel have a relationship that is adversarial on the surface but has moments of genuine connection and recognition running underneath it. The show has, in its best moments, depicted the mutual recognition between a student who is failing the system and a teacher who is also failing the system, failing it differently and from a different position, but failing it nonetheless. They are both caught in the same broken mechanism. They are both doing what they can to survive it. And sometimes across the desk and the gradebook and the detention slip, they see that in each other. That is a very specific and very honest piece of educational observation. And it is in The Simpsons. Sitting there for 36 years, in the middle of a comedy, the school's physical plant, by which I mean the building and its infrastructure, is as economically revealing as its educational practice. Springfield Elementary is consistently depicted as a building in varying states of disrepair. The boiler room, which groundskeeper Willie uses as a living space, is a detail that deserves more attention than it usually receives. Willie lives in the school. He has made his home in the basement of an elementary school, in what is described as a shack, which appears to be a self-constructed dwelling within the institutional space of the school's basement. This means that the school's facilities manager, the person responsible for maintaining the physical environment in which hundreds of children spend their days, does not have housing outside the school he maintains. He lives at work, not out of choice, or not primarily out of choice, but because housing in Springfield is apparently not sufficiently affordable or accessible to allow a school groundskeeper to maintain separate housing. This is a detail that would, in a realistic treatment, trigger significant institutional alarm. An employee living in the basement of a public school is not a routine situation. It involves a range of issues, including building code compliance, employee welfare, liability concerns, and the basic question of whether the school's administration is aware of and comfortable with this arrangement. Springfield Elementary's administration appears to be perfectly comfortable with it. Principal Skinner knows Willie lives in the basement. Superintendent Chalmers presumably knows. And the arrangement continues because changing it would require resources and attention and intervention that the school system is not equipped to provide. Willie's housing situation is the show's most concentrated expression of Springfield Elementary's relationship to the people who work within it. The school does not have enough resources to house its groundskeeper in conditions that would not make him a resident of the school basement. The school does not have enough administrative capacity to address this as a problem. And the community that the school serves does not have enough political power or civic engagement to demand better. Willie stays in the basement. The children learn in a building maintained by a man who lives in its basement, and the education they receive reflects the institutional condition of the building he maintains. One final detail about Springfield Elementary that has never received the attention it deserves. The school has a museum, not a trophy case, not a display of student achievement, an actual museum, referenced in at least one episode, containing artifacts and exhibits and the apparatus of institutional memory. The school's history is preserved and curated in a way that exceeds the apparent resources of the school itself. Why does Springfield Elementary have a museum? The most charitable interpretation is that Springfield Elementary has a history that the institution considers worth preserving, a history of graduates and events and community relationships that extends back far enough to constitute something worth curating. This would imply that the school is, in institutional terms, older and more established than its current state of underfunded dysfunction suggests. The less charitable interpretation is that the museum represents a misallocation of institutional priority. Resources that could go to books, to teacher salaries, to basic maintenance and repair of the building's failing infrastructure, have instead gone to the preservation and display of institutional history. The school has chosen to remember itself rather than to improve itself. to look backward at what it was rather than forward at what it could be. Both interpretations may be correct simultaneously. Springfield Elementary is an institution that was once something more than it is now, that has been gradually hollowed out by the same resource constraints and institutional failures and deliberate neglect that have hollowed out Springfield's other civic institutions. And in the face of that hollowing out, the museum is what remains of the institution's self-image. The memory of a time when the school was worth being proud of, preserved in glass cases in a room that the students passing it every day probably do not stop to read. The museum is Springfield Elementary's sadness made architectural, and like all of Springfield's saddest details, it sits in the background, visible if you look, ignored if you don't, and never once explained. Section 6. The Women of Springfield and the show's darkest running thread. There is a pattern in The Simpsons that the show has never explicitly acknowledged, never built an episode around, never treated as a subject worthy of direct examination. It runs beneath the surface of the series the way the river runs beneath the nuclear plant, carrying something through the town that most people have decided not to look at too directly. The pattern is this. Springfield is a profoundly difficult place to be, a woman with ambitions of any kind. This is not a reading against the grain of the show. This is not an application of an external framework to a text that was never meant to support it. The evidence is in the episodes themselves, in the outcomes of the women characters' attempts to pursue their own goals, in the consistent structural pressures that redirect those attempts back toward the domestic sphere, in the specific and recurring ways that the show depicts ambitious women being humiliated, contained, or redirected back to where Springfield has decided they belong. Let's start with Marge, because Marge is the show's central female character, and her arc across 36 seasons is the most complete portrait the show offers of what it means to be a woman in Springfield. Marge Simpson is, in the early seasons of the show, depicted as a woman who chose domesticity consciously and who maintains a nuanced relationship with that choice. She is not depicted as a prisoner of her domestic role. She is depicted as someone who made a choice, under specific circumstances, and who periodically revisits and re-examines that choice as her circumstances and her understanding of herself evolve. The specific circumstances of Marge's choice are important, and the show has depicted them across multiple flashback episodes. Marge was pregnant with Bart when she married Homer. The pregnancy was unplanned. The marriage was, in part, a response to the pregnancy and to the social expectations of the time and community in which they lived. Marge has a college-level intelligence and had ambitions of various kinds before the domestic trajectory took over. The show has depicted these abandoned ambitions periodically, in episodes where Marge returns to some area of her pre-domestic self. These episodes follow a consistent structure. Marge discovers or rediscovers a talent, a passion, a professional capacity. She pursues it. She succeeds, at least initially. She finds in the pursuit something that the domestic role does not provide. A sense of individual identity, a recognition of her own capacities, a connection to a world larger than the one bounded by the Simpson house. And then something happens that redirects her back to the domestic sphere. Sometimes it is a conflict with Homer. Sometimes it is a crisis in the family. Sometimes it is a failure or an obstacle in the new pursuit. The specific mechanism varies from episode to episode, but the outcome is consistent. Marge comes home. The excursion into the larger world ends. The domestic role is reaffirmed. The show does not depict this as tragedy. The show depicts this as homecoming. Marge coming home is framed as resolution, as the restoration of the appropriate order, as the thing that should happen because it is what Homer needs and what the family needs and what the structure of the show needs. This is the show's darkest running thread, dressed in the warm yellow glow of a loving family portrait. Let's look at specific instances of the pattern, because the evidence is most compelling in the details. Marge discovers that she has a talent for painting in an episode that is, on its surface, about Marge's creative awakening and her relationship to art and beauty. She paints. She paints well. A renowned art dealer recognizes her work and offers to show it. The show briefly enters the world of high culture recognition, depicting Marge as someone whose talent is genuine and whose potential in the art world is real. The episode ends with a choice that the show presents as a generous act of self-sacrifice. Marge paints something for Homer, specifically to please him, and in doing so, redirects her artistic vision away from its own development and toward the service of her domestic role. The art community is disappointed. Homer is pleased. Marge seems, the episode suggests, to find this satisfying. The show frames this as a portrait of the kind of love that finds expression in service to another, and it is that. Marge's love for Homer is genuine, and the episode depicts it genuinely. But it is also a portrait of creative ambition redirected into domesticity at the moment of its fullest potential development. The painting that could have been Marge's breakthrough becomes instead a gift for Homer. The artist returns to the wife. The episode about Marge's brief career as a police officer is even more pointed. Marge joins the Springfield police force. She is good at it. She is, demonstrably, more competent than most of her colleagues in the department, which is not a difficult bar to clear given the department's collective competence level, but which is nonetheless genuinely depicted. Marge has skills. The job uses them. The job also gives her something the domestic role does not: a structured environment with external recognition of her performance, a community of colleagues, a sense of contributing to the larger civic life of Springfield. And then Homer's resentment of her independence, his discomfort with her engagement in a world outside the home, creates a crisis that forces her to choose between her professional identity and her marriage. She chooses the marriage. She comes home. The police career ends. The show frames this, again, as a portrait of marital love and commitment. And again, it is that. The love is real, the commitment is real. But the structure of the choice, the fact that the choice is between professional identity and marriage, rather than between different configurations of a life that contains both, is the dark detail the show never examines directly. Marge's life, in Springfield, does not have room for both. The town's social structures, and Homer's particular emotional needs, do not create space for Marge to be both a wife and a police officer. She has to pick. And she picks Homer. Every time. Not because the show is cruel, but because the show has always been, at its emotional core, a story about Homer's experience of his family. Marge's choices are depicted through the lens of what they mean for Homer. Her returns to the domestic sphere are resolutions of Homer's narrative more than they are resolutions of hers. This is the show's original sin with respect to its female characters, and it is a sin that becomes more visible and more troubling the longer the show runs. Marge is an exceptionally drawn character, complex and warm and specific and real in ways that most television wives have never been, and she exists primarily in service of another character's story. Lisa's arc is different from Marge's because Lisa is still a child, and the show has consistently positioned her as the family member whose potential futures are still open. But the specific ways in which Springfield limits and frustrates Lisa across 36 seasons are revealing, because they are not the same limitations that would frustrate Bart. Bart is frustrated by academic structure, by the specific form of institutional compliance that Springfield Elementary demands. His frustration with the school system is coded, in the show's emotional grammar, as rebellion. Bart's resistance to institutional authority is presented as fundamentally energetic and alive, even when it is self-destructive. There is a kind of vitality to Bart's failure that makes it, within the show's emotional register, more sympathetic than it is alarming. Lisa's frustrations are different. Lisa is not frustrated by institutional structure. She thrives within it. The things that frustrate Lisa are the things that institutional structures do not recognize as real problems. The social isolation that accompanies exceptional intelligence in a community that does not value intelligence. The specific kind of loneliness that comes from seeing clearly in a community that has agreed not to see. The exhaustion of being, consistently and perpetually, the person in the room who cares more than anyone else about the thing that matters most, and who is consistently and perpetually unable to make anyone else care as much. Lisa's frustration is coded, in the show's emotional grammar, as insufferable. She is the child who knows too much and says so too often, and makes everyone around her uncomfortable with the accuracy of her observations. The show has, across 36 seasons, given her the thing that Bart never receives: the experience of being socially punished for being right. This is a specific and gendered pattern. The show depicts Bart's failures with warmth, and Bart's successes with celebration. It depicts Lisa's successes as alienating, and her failures as clarifying. When Lisa is right, the show often finds ways to undercut her rightness, to have the universe deliver a comeuppance that brings her back to the level of the community she has been accurate about. When Lisa is wrong, the show treats it as a humanizing moment, a proof that even the smartest person can be surprised by the complexity of experience. Lisa is constantly being brought down, and the bringer is most often Springfield itself, the community that cannot sustain the level of expectation that Lisa's presence creates. Patty and Selma Bouvier, Marge's sisters, offer a counterpoint to Marge's domestic arc that the show has used, across many episodes, to make specific and not always flattering observations about the alternatives to marriage and domesticity that Springfield offers its women. Patty and Selma are employed, they work at the DMV, they have apartments, they have independence, in the narrow economic sense, from the domestic structures that define Marge's life. They are not wives. They are not, for most of the show's run, mothers, though Selma's desire for a child has been a recurring thread. They have professional identities and financial independence, and the kind of autonomy that comes from not having organized your life around another person's needs. And the show depicts their lives as deeply unhappy. Not because they are bad people, though the show sometimes treats them with a cruelty that goes beyond what their characters warrant, but because Springfield's available options for single women who are not in the mold of what the show considers conventionally desirable do not include much in the way of satisfaction. Patty and Selma work dead-end jobs in a dysfunctional civic institution. They spend their evenings watching television and smoking and pursuing relationships that consistently fail. They are presented, across the show's run, as cautionary tales, as what happens to women who did not make the choice Marge made, or could not make it, or were not offered it. This is not an endorsement of their lifestyle by the show. The show has consistently treated Patty and Selma's alternative to Marge's domestic arrangement as inferior to that arrangement, funnier and sadder and less complete. Their independence is depicted as loneliness. Their professional identity is depicted as joyless routine. Their lack of a family is depicted, almost universally, as loss. The show does not consider that Patty and Selma's unhappiness might not be intrinsic to their choices, but might be a product of the specific poverty of options that Springfield provides for women who are not organizing their lives around marriage and family. In a different town, with different institutional support and different social structures and different economic opportunities, Patty and Selma might have lives that were genuinely satisfying. In Springfield, those alternatives are not available, and the show presents the result, their unhappiness, as evidence of the lifestyle's failure rather than as evidence of Springfield's failure to accommodate it. The women who pass through Springfield as guest characters, as peripheral figures in specific episodes, add texture to this portrait that is sometimes quite dark. The episode about Homer's secretary, who becomes a source of genuine friendship and professional support for Homer before the friendship is misread as a romantic relationship and ends in a complicated dissolution of the working arrangement, depicts a woman who is competent, perceptive, and genuinely kind, and who is positioned by the narrative as a threat to the Simpson marriage the moment she becomes more than a peripheral figure. Her competence and her genuine care for Homer are the things that make her threatening in the show's framing. She is too helpful, too attentive, too present, and so she must be removed from Homer's orbit. The story is not her story. She is a character in Homer's story. She exists in the narrative primarily to create a crisis that ultimately reaffirms the Simpsons' marriage. And when the crisis is resolved, she disappears, because her function in the narrative has been fulfilled and Springfield does not need her anymore. This is how most of Springfield's women are organized, around functions, around what they provide for the main characters and the main story. The functions are real, and the care the show takes with characterization is genuine. But the structural position of women in Springfield's narrative is consistently functional rather than central. Except for Lisa. Lisa is the exception, the character who is allowed to have her own story, her own interiority, her own relationship to the world that is not organized around service to another character's narrative. And the price she pays for that exception is the specific kind of narrative punishment that the show reserves for characters who do not fit the structures Springfield has built for them. Lisa is right, and she is punished for being right. She is smart, and she is punished for being smart. She is ambitious, and Springfield finds ways to limit her ambition. She is, in the end, still a child in a house that was built around Homer's needs, in a town that was built around Burns's needs, in a show that was built around a family portrait in which she is the least comfortably accommodated member. This does not make The Simpsons a bad show. It makes The Simpsons an honest one, because the structural position of women in Springfield is not a failure of the show's imagination. It is a faithful portrait of the structural position of women in the kind of American community that Springfield represents. And that portrait, honest and unresolved and never wrapped in a redemptive arc, is one of the most important things the show has ever produced. Sideshow Mel, who is not a woman and not the subject of this section, is nonetheless worth a brief mention here as a counterpoint. Mel is a character who performs a kind of extravagant, theatrical femininity, who occupies the space of the flamboyant male performer in a way that Springfield accommodates with more warmth and less friction than it accommodates many of its female characters' self-expression. This is its own observation about the show's gender politics, and it is not a simple one. Springfield's treatment of gender nonconformity is inconsistent across the show's run, sometimes generous and sometimes not, and the inconsistency itself is a reflection of the social complexity of the communities that Springfield represents. But the specific case of Mel, and the specific comfort with which Springfield accommodates his theatrical self-presentation, sits in interesting and complicated contrast with the show's treatment of its female characters' attempts at self-expression and independence. The comparison is not a condemnation of either. It is an observation about the specific and idiosyncratic ways in which community tolerance operates. What a community accepts and what it resists is not a simple matter of ideology. It is a matter of specific histories, specific personalities, specific relationships that have built up over time to create a local culture that is comfortable with some things and uncomfortable with others. Springfield is comfortable with Mel. Springfield is uncomfortable with Marge as a police officer. Both facts are true. Both say something real about Springfield. The show's most devastating portrait of a woman in Springfield is not Marge's, though Marge's is the most sustained. It is Edna Krabappel's. We touched on Edna in the previous section, in the context of teacher burnout and institutional failure. But her story deserves more than that frame, because what happened to Edna Krabappel is the story of what happens to a woman who allowed Springfield to defeat her, and who then found, late in the show's run, a way back to something like hope. Edna's romantic history across the show's run is a portrait of a woman trying, repeatedly and with diminishing optimism, to find a genuine partner in a town that does not produce many of them. Her relationship history includes Principal Skinner, a man who is emotionally unavailable in ways that the show has depicted with real sympathy and real frustration, because Skinner's emotional unavailability is itself a product of the specific psychological damage that the show has given him. He is not a villain. He is a man who cannot fully access his own feelings because his identity is a performance he has been maintaining for 20 years, and the performance has consumed whatever was underneath it. Edna loved Skinner. The show made this clear across many seasons, and what Skinner could offer her was limited by what he could offer anyone, which was a carefully managed emotional surface behind which the actual person remained perpetually inaccessible. And then Edna found Ned Flanders, and the show, in a late-season development that many fans did not expect, allowed Edna to be genuinely, fully happy for the first time in the show's run. The Edna-Ned relationship was, by the standards of The Simpsons' emotional register, a success. Ned's warmth and Ned's genuine care and Ned's capacity for full emotional presence, however complicated by his psychological conditioning, gave Edna something that the rest of Springfield had consistently failed to offer. And then Marcia Wallace, the voice actress who had played Edna Krabappel since the show's first season, died in 2013. The show retired the character. Edna Krabappel was given an in-universe death, her passing acknowledged, her absence mourned, by the town and by the audience simultaneously. The specific loss of Edna is worth sitting with for a moment, because Edna's story arc, from burned-out cynical teacher to late-life genuine happiness, was one of the few female arcs in the show's history that did not end with the woman's return to a domestic role she had chosen to leave, or with the punishment of her ambition. Edna found happiness on her own terms, in a relationship she chose, at a time in her life when the show's emotional logic might have suggested it was too late. And then she was gone. Not because the show decided her story was over, but because the real-world person who gave her voice was gone. And the town of Springfield, which has forgotten so many things, has not forgotten Edna Krabappel. The tribute to her, worked into the show after Marcia Wallace's death, he is one of the few moments in the show's 36 years when Springfield itself seemed to recognize that it had lost something irreplaceable. Not a plot point, not a narrative function, a person. A woman who had spent her professional life in that school, giving that town more than it had ever given her back. Springfield owes Edna Krabappel a debt it can never pay, and the show knows it. Section 7. Sideshow Bob. The tragedy of the smartest man in Springfield. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr. has attempted to murder Bart Simpson a number of times across the show's run. He has been foiled by various combinations of Bart's resourcefulness, the intervention of other characters, his own elaborate planning reaching a point of complexity that creates opportunities for failure, and the fundamental comedic rule that the antagonist in a children's cartoon cannot be allowed to successfully murder the protagonist. What gets less attention, because the murderous intent is so colorful and the foiling is so funny, is why. Why has one of the most intelligent and culturally sophisticated characters in the show's universe devoted so much of his extraordinary capacity to the repeated attempted murder of a 10-year-old? The answer is in the beginning, the origin story. The sequence of events that took a man of genuine talent and real intellectual depth and turned him toward a vendetta that has consumed his adult life. Bob was Krusty the Clown's sidekick. This is the fact that contextualizes everything, and it is worth dwelling on it rather than using it as a quick establishing note. Sideshow, Bob was employed as the sidekick to a performing clown on a local children's television show. He was educated at Yale. He has genuine expertise in opera, in literature, in the kinds of cultural pursuits that the show associates with high-minded cultivation and intellectual seriousness. And his job in Springfield's entertainment economy was to absorb physical comedy abuse as the incompetent foil to a man whose act he considered beneath him. The humiliation of this position is the engine of Bob's entire arc. He is not a man who became criminal because he lacked opportunities or because his circumstances pushed him toward crime. He is a man of exceptional capacity who found that Springfield's legitimate economy had nothing better to offer him than degradation. And the degradation, sustained over time, produced in him a bitterness that eventually expressed itself as the willingness to commit serious crimes. His first major crime, the one that sent him to prison and began the Bart vendetta, was framing Krusty for armed robbery. This was not a random act of violence. It was a specific targeted response to a specific perceived wrong, an attempt to use Krusty's removal to step into Krusty's position and demonstrate that he, Bob, could do something genuinely better with the platform that Krusty had been wasting. The framing of Krusty was Bob's audition. He wanted to show Springfield what it had been getting wrong. He wanted to demonstrate, by taking over Krusty's show and improving it, that the town's entertainment economy had been allocating its resources incorrectly. That the position of children's television host was worth more than Krusty was making of it, and that a man of Bob's cultural education could make it into something genuinely worthwhile. Bart unraveled the frame. Bob went to prison, and Bart became in Bob's mind the symbol of everything that Springfield had done to him. The child who took away the only serious opportunity Bob had ever been given to do something with his gifts. The representative of the town's preference for Krusty's crude, familiar, reliable mediocrity over Bob's ambitious, cultivated, demanding excellence. From Bob's perspective, which the show has always allowed to be articulate and internally coherent, Bart didn't just send an innocent man to prison. Bart preserved Springfield's mediocrity. Bart chose the clown over the serious artist. Bart acted as the instrument of a community that does not want to be improved, that resists elevation, that would rather laugh at Krusty's seltzer bottle gags than engage with the art that Bob wanted to bring to the platform. The murderous rage that this produced is disproportionate, and the show is not endorsing it. But the show is also, across many Sideshow Bob episodes, taking the time to make Bob's position comprehensible. Not right, not acceptable, but comprehensible. The rage of an exceptional person trapped in a world that cannot accommodate his exceptionalism is one of the show's persistent themes, and Bob is its most extreme expression. Let's examine what Bob does with his periods of freedom because they are revealing. Between prison stints, Bob has lived in various places outside Springfield and has attempted to build lives that might satisfy the ambitions that Springfield could not accommodate. He has married. He has had a child. He has lived in Italy, in a small village, farming and participating in a community that his intelligence and cultivation fit into more naturally than Springfield ever allowed. These episodes are the show at its most sympathetic toward Bob. They depict a man who, outside the context of his Springfield vendetta, is genuinely capable of a good life. He is a loving husband, or at least he was before his murderous ambitions reasserted themselves. He is a father with genuine warmth toward his child. He is a person who, in environments that are not Springfield, can direct his intelligence and energy toward things that are not terrible. The Italian village episode is particularly striking. Bob has, in the small community of a Tuscan village, found something close to what he has always wanted: recognition. A community that values culture and refinement. A place where his knowledge of opera and literature and art is not an eccentricity but a natural part of the social fabric. A life that fits the person he has always understood himself to be. And he gives it up. He cannot resist the opportunity to kill Bart when Bart arrives in the village. The vendetta reasserts itself. The life he has built dissolves because he cannot not try to murder the child who undid his one chance at legitimacy. This is the tragedy of Sideshow Bob expressed most cleanly. The vendetta is self-defeating. Every attempt on Bart's life destroys something good that Bob has managed to build in the interim. The rage that the vendetta requires is incompatible with the peace that the good life requires. Bob cannot have both. And he consistently, compulsively, inevitably chooses the vendetta. Why? The show's surface answer is that Bob is a villain, and villains do villainous things. But the show's deeper answer, available if you spend enough time with the character, is more disturbing. Bob cannot let the vendetta go because the vendetta is the last connection he has to the moment in Springfield when he still believed things could be different. When he still believed that the town could be improved, that the platform could be elevated, that intelligence and cultivation could win in a competition with mediocrity. The moment Bart unmade all of that, Bob's investment in Springfield's potential was converted into rage. And the rage, however terrible, is at least a feeling. It is at least an engagement with the world. If Bob lets the vendetta go, he has to accept not just that Springfield preferred Krusty, but that it always will. That the competition between his vision and the town's preference was decided permanently against him. That exceptional intelligence and cultural cultivation are not, in Springfield, winning qualities. To let the vendetta go, Bob would have to grieve. And the grief is too large. So instead he plans. He plots. He builds elaborate scenarios that always fail at the last moment. And each failure is, in a terrible way, a relief. Because as long as he is still trying, he has not yet had to accept the permanent answer. Bob's relationship to his family, particularly his brother Cecil and, in later seasons, his own son Gino, adds complexity to the portrait. Cecil Terwilliger has appeared in multiple episodes and has his own complicated relationship to the shadow Bob's reputation casts over the family. Cecil was, in his own telling, the more academically promising of the two Terwilliger brothers, and he has spent a significant portion of his adult life dealing with the consequences of Bob's criminal notoriety. Bob's crimes have defined the Terwilliger name in Springfield in ways that Cecil resents. The episode involving Cecil is one of the most thematically rich in the Bob canon. It reveals that Cecil auditioned to be Krusty's sidekick before Bob, and was passed over in favor of Bob, which then led to Bob being humiliated in the position that Cecil actually wanted. The humiliation that made Bob what he is was produced, at least in part, by the show business evaluation of two brothers, and the one who got the job was humiliated by it, while the one who was rejected avoided the humiliation by being excluded from the opportunity. This is a specific and bitter irony. Cecil wanted the sidekick position. Bob did not really. Bob accepted it for lack of anything better, and the resulting humiliation was visited on the person who had the least investment in the role and would therefore be most damaged by being trapped in it. The Terwilliger family's relationship to Springfield is a concentrated portrait of how a community can produce specific kinds of psychological damage in specific kinds of people. They are not ordinary people. They are exceptional people. And Springfield's exceptional people tend to be damaged in proportion to their exceptionalism because the town cannot accommodate them, and the gap between what they are and what Springfield allows them to be is a wound that never fully closes. Bob's relationship to Springfield itself, separate from the Bart vendetta, is worth examining because it reveals something about the show's understanding of its own setting. Bob has returned to Springfield repeatedly. Each time he is released from prison, each time the legal system determines that he has served his sentence and may re-enter society, he ends up back in Springfield. Not because Springfield is where he must be, legally. Because Springfield is where Bart is, and Bart is where the vendetta is, and the vendetta is the organizing principle of Bob's life. But there is another reason Bob keeps returning to Springfield that the show implies without stating. Springfield is the only place where Bob's intelligence registers as extraordinary. Outside Springfield, in the wider world, Bob is merely educated, merely cultured. merely one of many people who have studied and read and developed the kind of refined tastes that characterize a certain kind of upper-class intellectual culture. The world outside Springfield has many people like Bob. It has places where his cultivation is expected rather than exceptional. It has communities where the opera references land without explanation and the literary allusions are returned in kind. In those communities, Bob is not special. He is just another person with a good education and a well-developed aesthetic sense. The same attributes that make him exceptional in Springfield make him ordinary elsewhere. Springfield is where Bob matters. Springfield is where his intelligence is so far beyond the population average that it constitutes a form of power, a form of distinction, a form of identity. Leaving Springfield means leaving the one context in which he is truly, unmistakably remarkable. And this is the trap. Not the legal one, not the vendetta, but this. Bob is addicted to being the smartest person in the room. And Springfield is the room where that's most easily true. The show has built Bob's character with enough care that this reading is supported by the text. He is a villain, yes, but he is a villain who is, in part, addicted to being in the only place where he registers as extraordinary. And that addiction keeps pulling him back to the town that humiliated him, back to the child who undid his one chance, back to the life he can't quite build and can't quite leave. Sideshow Bob is Springfield's most dramatic expression of a truth the show has always known. The town is a trap, not because it prevents people from leaving, but because it makes leaving feel like loss, like exile, like choosing to be ordinary instead of exceptional, even if the exceptionalism is built on a foundation of degradation. Better to be the most dangerous man in Springfield than to be nothing special anywhere else. That is the saddest thing in the show's universe. And the show knows it is sad, which is why, in its best Sideshow Bob episodes, it allows him moments of genuine pathos, real emotional access to the person underneath the villain, the Yale-educated man who just wanted to do something worthy of his gifts and ended up spending his life trying to kill a child. Springfield did this to him. Springfield and Krusty and Bart, and the specific configuration of circumstances that placed an exceptional person in an environment that could not accommodate him and then humiliated him when he tried to do something about it. One more dimension of Bob's character that deserves attention: his relationship to the law. Bob has a detailed and specific knowledge of the legal system, which the show has used for comedy in episodes where he exploits technical legal loopholes to secure release from custody. He has, at various points, secured legal victories that should not be available to him, using his intelligence and his knowledge of legal procedure to work systems that were not designed to be worked by someone with his level of sophistication. This is the show being honest about something that the legal system itself is often not honest about. The law provides significantly different outcomes depending on the sophistication of the person navigating it. A person with Yale-level education, with genuine analytical intelligence, with the kind of strategic patience that Bob possesses, can navigate the legal system in ways that a less sophisticated person cannot. The law is nominally equal in its application. It is not equal in its accessibility. And Bob's ability to exploit that inequality, while played for comedy, is a real observation about a real disparity. The comedy produces a villain who keeps getting out of prison despite having done terrible things. The observation produces a portrait of a system that is more accessible to some defendants than others, and that accessibility correlates with exactly the kinds of educational and cultural privilege that Bob possesses and that Springfield, generally, does not. Bob uses his privilege to escape consequences for crimes. The show treats this as funny, but it is also an accurate description of how privilege operates within the legal system, and the accuracy is the joke's foundation. We laugh because we recognize it. We recognize it because it is true. Section 8. The Treehouse of Horror Canon Problem and Why It Might Not Be Fiction. Every October, The Simpsons broadcasts a special anthology episode in which the normal rules of the show are suspended. Characters die and are not dead in the next episode. Reality bends in ways it does not bend in the canonical series. The horror tropes of literature and cinema and television are applied to the Simpsons universe with varying degrees of fidelity and varying degrees of commitment to the anthology's own internal logic. These episodes are called the Treehouse of Horror specials, and they have been a cornerstone of the show's annual calendar since the second season. They are beloved, they are inventive, they are, in many years, among the most carefully crafted episodes the show produces, combining the show's satirical sensibility with the specific pleasures of horror as a genre in ways that neither straight horror nor straight comedy could achieve alone. And they are officially non-canonical. The show has always maintained this. What happens in the Treehouse episodes does not count. The deaths are not real. The transformations do not persist. The invasions and the possessions and the apocalypses are all contained within the anthology's frame, separate from the show's ongoing continuity, available to be extreme and dark and fatal in ways that the canonical show does not permit. Except that the separation between the Treehouse episodes and canonical continuity has never been as clean as the framing suggests. The contamination runs in both directions. Details from the Treehouse episodes have influenced the canonical show's visual and conceptual vocabulary. Versions of Treehouse scenarios have appeared in slightly modified forms in canonical episodes, and some of the observations that the Treehouse format makes most explicitly about Springfield and its residents are observations that are also present in more muted form in the canonical series. The Treehouse of Horror format works, when it works best, not as a departure from the show's reality, but as a concentrated amplification of something that is already present in that reality. The horror is not external to Springfield. It is Springfield's own darkness, turned up to a frequency that the regular episodes cannot reach. Let's look at this more carefully through specific Treehouse episodes. The first Treehouse special includes an adaptation of The Telltale Heart, Poe's famous story about guilt and its manifestations. The story is placed in Springfield and involves Homer. The choice of source material is interesting, because Poe's story is specifically about a man whose sense of guilt produces symptoms that he cannot distinguish from external reality. The guilt creates an experience of persecution that the rational mind cannot counter, because the guilt is not a rational phenomenon. It is an emotional one. Homer, in this adaptation, is a character who has done something wrong and is being tormented by the consequences. The Treehouse framing allows this to be explicit, to be dramatized as actual horror, rather than as the comedy of consequence that the canonical show would produce from the same basic material. And what the explicit dramatization reveals is something that the canonical show has always implied. Homer's psychology contains a dimension of guilt, of awareness of his own failures, that his cognitive limitations prevent him from fully processing. The canonical Homer cannot process his guilt clearly because his brain, damaged by the crayon and the radiation, and the decades of cognitive erosion in Springfield's contaminated environment, does not have the processing capacity for clear self-examination. What the Treehouse episode does is give us the horror version of what is running in the background of Homer's consciousness in every canonical episode. The guilt that cannot be expressed clearly because the mind that contains it is not clear. The second episode in that first Treehouse special involves the Simpsons being abducted by aliens and subjected to experiments. This is played as horror comedy, as an encounter with genuinely alien intelligence that is incomprehensible in its motivations and terrifying in its power. The aliens, Kang and Kodos, become recurring Treehouse characters, showing up annually to observe or interfere with Springfield's affairs. Kang and Kodos are remarkable creations because they are genuinely alien in the sense that their motivations and their understanding of human life are consistently depicted as incomprehensible to the human characters. They speak in a register that sounds comprehensible but is fundamentally indifferent to human values and human concerns. They observe Springfield with the detachment of beings for whom the human experience is interesting but not important. This is a recognizable dynamic within Springfield itself. The town contains people who observe it from a position of genuine detachment, whose power and perspective place them so far above the ordinary concerns of Springfield's residents that the residents' experiences are, from that perspective, interesting but not important. Burns observes Springfield this way. The EPA officials who dome Springfield observe it this way. Kang and Kodos are the Treehouse format's most explicit version of this dynamic. They are aliens, but they are also a version of every powerful force in Springfield that observes the town's residents with the kind of detachment that comes from never having been subject to the town's specific pressures and consequences. The Homer 3 Treehouse segment deserves special attention because it performs, in animated form, one of the most genuinely strange experiments in television history. In Homer 3, Homer escapes into a three-dimensional world that is explicitly depicted as a digital simulation, a constructed reality with its own rules and its own physics that differ from the two-dimensional world of the canonical show. The segment was produced using then state-of-the-art computer animation that created a visual language markedly different from the show's normal style. Homer exists, for the segment's duration, in a fundamentally different kind of space. And then the simulation collapses. The three-dimensional world is destroyed, and Homer falls through into a world that looks like a real-world city street depicted in live-action footage, completely different from either the 2D animated world of the canonical show or the 3D animated world of the segment. The final image of the segment is Homer, rendered in something approaching three-dimensional animation, walking through what appears to be a real city at night, looking confused, encountering an erotic bakery, and disappearing into the unknown. It is genuinely strange. Even within the treehouse's wide latitude for strangeness, it is strange. And it is strange in a specific way that the show has never revisited or explained. Homer fell through from his own world into something that looks like our world. The boundary between Springfield's animated reality and the live-action reality in which the show is produced is briefly, explicitly depicted as permeable. Homer does not belong in live action, and yet there he is, confused and displaced and walking down a real street. The Treehouse format gave the show permission to do this, to acknowledge in the most explicit form it has ever taken, the gap between the fiction and the reality. Homer is an animated character. He lives in an animated world. The live-action footage at the end of Homer 3 is the show looking directly at the artifice of its own construction and acknowledging it, letting Homer briefly encounter the world that contains him without being of him. This is the Treehouse format doing what it does best, taking something that the canonical show handles through implication and performing it explicitly, in visual form, at maximum intensity. Homer is a fictional character who exists in a constructed reality. The canonical show implies this whenever it breaks the fourth wall. Homer 3 shows you what it looks like when the construction breaks, and the character encounters the real world from which he has always been separated by the medium. It looks like a man walking down a night street, looking for something, not finding it, disappearing into the dark. The relationship between the Treehouse episodes and the canonical show's depiction of death is one of the most consistently interesting aspects of the format's contribution to the show's larger project. The canonical show has a complex and not entirely consistent relationship to death. Major characters have died and remained dead. Minor characters have died and been resurrected without explanation. The show's floating timeline creates a specific kind of ontological instability that makes the permanence of any event, including death, somewhat uncertain. The Treehouse episodes engage with death directly, explicitly, and without the canonical show's need to maintain character availability for future episodes. Characters die constantly in the Treehouse format. Entire populations of Springfield are killed in some segments. Death is available as a narrative tool in a way that it is not in the canonical show. But the Treehouse format has always been aware of the specific pleasure this creates for the audience. There is something that feels genuinely released about watching Springfield characters die in the Treehouse context, not because the deaths are satisfying in themselves, but because they represent an acknowledgement of mortality that the canonical show systematically denies. The canonical show's floating timeline and its resistance to permanent consequence means that the characters are functionally immortal. They cannot grow old. They cannot die. They are frozen. The Treehouse episodes break the immortality, temporarily, safely, within a frame that allows the show to acknowledge death as a concept while maintaining the canonical character's availability for the next episode. And the specific deaths that the Treehouse format allows are often deaths that feel, within the logic of the show's universe, appropriate. Burns dies in various Treehouse segments in ways that feel like the logical conclusion of his character's arc. Homer dies in ways that feel like the accumulation of all his canonical near-deaths finally catching up with him. The Treehouse deaths are not random. They are versions of the canonical characters' trajectories taken to their natural conclusion, which means the Treehouse episodes are not separate from the canonical show's reality. They are the canonical show's reality projected forward, to the point where it arrives at outcomes the canonical show is not permitted to actually reach. The Treehouse format shows you where the story goes if you let it follow its own logic all the way to the end. And where it goes, more often than not, is dark. Springfield's story, followed to its natural conclusion, is a horror story. The canonical show keeps resetting before it gets there. The Treehouse format lets you see the ending. There is one Treehouse scenario that has haunted fans more than most, and it involves the specific question of what Springfield would look like if the town's institutional failures reached their logical extreme. In the scenario, Springfield's civic life collapses. The specific mechanism of the collapse varies by telling, but the outcome is consistent. The structures that maintain community life, the government, the police, the economy, the social contracts that allow people to live together, dissolve. What remains is a landscape of competing interests, of individual and group survival, of the specific kind of violence that emerges when institutional structures fail to maintain order. The scenario is presented as horror, but it is recognizable. It is recognizable because it follows directly from the institutional failures that the canonical show has always depicted. Wigham's police department, failing consistently. Quimby's government, serving itself rather than the community. Burns's plant, poisoning the water. The mob, operating in the margins. These are not stable conditions. They are conditions that, if followed to their logical extreme, produce exactly the kind of institutional collapse that the treehouse scenario depicts. The horror of the scenario is not that it is fantastical. The horror is that it is the canonical show's reality taken one step further. Springfield is already most of the way there. The treehouse format just shows you the next step. This is what the treehouse episodes are really doing, at their best. Not departing from Springfield's reality, completing it, showing the ending that the canonical format is not allowed to reach. And the ending looks like horror because the beginning, which the canonical show has been depicting for 36 years, already contains the seeds of it. The Treehouse of Horror is not separate from The Simpsons. It is The Simpsons without the reset button. Section 9. Springfield's religious architecture god, Reverend Lovejoy, and the town's spiritual decay. Springfield has a church. The First Church of Springfield has been a recurring location throughout the show's run, and its pastor, Reverend Timothy Lovejoy, has been a recurring character since the beginning. The church is a visual anchor of Springfield's civic landscape, sitting in the town center as a reference point for the community's relationship to organized religion, to spiritual life, to the question of what the residents of Springfield believe about the nature of their existence and the forces that govern it. The church is almost always depicted as being on the verge of irrelevance. Lovejoy's congregation is small, his sermons are unengaging. His interest in the spiritual welfare of his parishioners has calcified, across the show's run, into a professional obligation carried out with the minimum of genuine investment. He is a man who became a minister because it was a career, and who has remained a minister because it is the career he has, and the gap between the calling and the career has widened across the years until the calling is barely a memory. The specific cause of Lovejoy's spiritual disillusionment is, the show has suggested, Ned Flanders. Ned's constant calls to Lovejoy for spiritual guidance in the early years of Lovejoy's ministry were so frequent and so detailed and so demanding of genuine pastoral attention that Lovejoy simply wore out. He gave everything he had to Ned's spiritual needs and found, at the end of that giving, that he had nothing left for the rest of his congregation. This is a very specific and very honest observation about what happens to helping professions when the demand for help exceeds the capacity of the helper. Lovejoy burned out on Ned, and the burnout did not just affect his capacity to help Ned. It collapsed his capacity for genuine pastoral engagement across the board. He retreated into professional performance, into the surface behaviors of ministry without the spiritual substance, because the spiritual substance had been exhausted by a single parishioner's seemingly inexhaustible need. The irony is precise and painful. Ned, the most devout person in Springfield, the person who takes his faith most seriously and who demands the most from the spiritual resources the church should provide, is the person who destroyed the church's capacity to provide genuine spiritual resources. His need for God was routed through Lovejoy, and Lovejoy could not sustain it. God exists in Springfield. This is a canonical fact, not a theological position taken by the show, but a matter of the show's own internal fiction. God has appeared, spoken to Homer, and been depicted with a face and a voice and a perspective that is, in the show's rendering, divine. The show's God is not the ineffable divine of serious theology. The show's God is a specific being with specific characteristics, appearing within the show's visual and narrative register, engaging with the show's characters directly. And the show's God talks to Homer, not to Ned, not to Lovejoy, not to the person who has organized his entire life around faith. The show's God shows up for Homer, who sleeps through church and drinks heavily, and commits the full catalog of the 7 deadly sins on a rotating basis. We have established this point before in this script, but it is worth returning to here because, in the context of Springfield's religious architecture, the choice of Homer as God's primary Springfield interlocutor has a specific meaning. If God is available in Springfield, and if God speaks specifically to the person who is least engaged in formal religious practice, then the church and Lovejoy's ministry and Ned's devoted attendance and the whole apparatus of organized religion in Springfield is either irrelevant to the divine relationship or actively in the way of it. The show does not take a position on whether organized religion is false, or whether Ned's faith is wrong, or whether Lovejoy's burned-out professional ministry is a betrayal of genuine spiritual life. But by consistently routing its divine interactions through Homer, rather than through the church, it makes a structural argument that formal religious institution and genuine spiritual contact are not the same thing. And in Springfield, they may be mutually exclusive. The church is a civic institution, like the police department and the city government and the school system, and like those institutions, it has failed. Not in any dramatic, visible way. In the slow, grinding way that institutions fail when the people staffing them have lost the connection between the institution's stated purpose and their own investment in that purpose. Lovejoy's church is going through the motions. The congregation is thin. The sermons are rote. The pastoral care is professional rather than genuine. And God, in Springfield, is apparently more available at Moe's Tavern on a Sunday morning than at the First Church of Springfield, if Homer's experience is any guide. The specific content of Lovejoy's sermons, across the many episodes in which they have appeared, is worth examining because the show has used them to make observations about organized religion's relationship to the communities it serves. Lovejoy's sermons have, over the years, addressed an enormous range of topics, many of which have very little to do with the spiritual concerns one would expect a minister to prioritize. He has sermonized about sports, about local politics, about the specific grievances of his most prominent parishioners, about topics that have been brought to his attention by community pressures and expectations rather than by any discernible spiritual calling. This is the church as community institution rather than as spiritual entity. Lovejoy is not primarily ministering to the souls of his congregation. He is primarily managing the community's relationship to the institution he represents. He is a social function as much as a spiritual one, and the social function is the one that has survived the burnout. Ned Flanders's faith exists in an interesting relationship to Lovejoy's institutional performance. Ned is a genuine believer in a way that Lovejoy has, apparently, long since ceased to be. Ned's faith is active, engaged, demanding of itself. He takes seriously the moral and ethical requirements of the religious tradition he has committed to. He applies those requirements to his behavior in ways that are, by any observable standard, sincere. And yet Ned's faith is also, as the show has revealed, a product of behavioral conditioning rather than genuine spiritual development. He was programmed to be good by a psychiatrist who conditioned the aggression out of him in childhood. His compliance with the requirements of his faith is not freely chosen in the same way that genuine faith would be. It is, to some extent, the psychological conditioning of his childhood expressing itself in religious form. This is a complex and troubling portrait of faith. The show does not dismiss Ned's belief as fake, but it does locate its roots in psychology rather than in genuine encounter with the divine. Ned believes because he was made to behave in ways that make belief appropriate, rather than because he has experienced anything that would make belief necessary. The God who speaks to Homer has never spoken to Ned, and Ned's faith, which was conditioned into him, persists in the absence of any direct experience that would justify it to a skeptical mind. The show is not making a case against religion, but it is making a specific and careful observation about the difference between institutional faith and genuine spiritual experience, and about the specific ways in which each of those things can be present without the other. Reverend Lovejoy's wife, Helen, is one of the show's most consistent portraits of religious social performance. Helen Lovejoy's most famous line, her repeated outraged cry of concern for the children, has become one of the show's most quoted recurring gags. She invokes the children as a moral argument in situations where the children have no relevant stake, and her invocation is always motivated by her own moral discomfort rather than any genuine concern for the children's welfare. Helen is the church's social dimension made character. She is the person who uses religious and moral language to police the community's behavior in ways that serve her own social position rather than anyone's genuine welfare. She is the keeper of community standards not because she genuinely cares about those standards, but because the enforcement of those standards is the source of her social authority. This is a portrait of a specific kind of religious social function that exists in many communities. The person who invokes the moral framework of the community not to guide it but to control it. Who uses the language of concern for others to pursue their own social agenda? Who has mastered the performance of religious virtue without developing any particular investment in the substance of it? Helen and Lovejoy are, in this reading, a matched pair. He performs ministry without genuine pastoral investment. She performs moral concern without genuine care for the community's welfare. They are both serving the institution rather than the purpose the institution was meant to serve. And together they represent Springfield's religious life at its most thoroughly hollowed out. The show has, in various episodes, brought in religious figures from outside Springfield's institutional Christianity, and these encounters are always revealing about what the canonical religious landscape lacks. The episode involving the Movementarians, the cult that briefly takes over a significant portion of Springfield's population, is the show's most sustained exploration of what happens when genuine faith hunger encounters a manipulative but structurally effective religious offer. The Movementarians succeed in recruiting Springfield's residents because the residents have a genuine need for spiritual meaning that Springfield's official religious institutions are not meeting. Lovejoy's church does not give people the experience of genuine community, of meaningful ritual, of the sense of belonging to something larger than themselves that organized religion, at its best, can provide. The Movementarians offer all of these things, manipulatively and with a controlling agenda, but the form of the offer is compelling because the need it addresses is genuine. This is the show's most direct observation about spiritual hunger. Springfield's population is spiritually hungry. They need something that the official religious institution has failed to provide. And when something comes along that appears to offer it, even something as obviously problematic as the Movementarians, they reach for it, because the hunger is real. And hunger, in the absence of genuine nourishment, makes people vulnerable to things that look like food but are not. The Movementarians episode is not anti-religion. It is a diagnosis of what a failed religious institution leaves behind when it stops genuinely serving its community. It leaves a hunger. And hunger is dangerous. The show's depiction of prayer across its many episodes is quietly fascinating because it is inconsistent in ways that are themselves meaningful. Characters pray in Springfield. They pray in moments of genuine desperation, in moments of gratitude, in moments where the situation feels beyond their capacity to manage through ordinary means. And the show has treated the outcomes of these prayers with remarkable variety. Sometimes prayer seems to work, or at least to be followed by outcomes that could be read as answers. Sometimes it clearly does not. Sometimes the question of whether prayer worked is left deliberately ambiguous. This inconsistency is not a failure of the show's theological position. It is the show's theological position. Springfield's religious landscape is one in which the divine is genuinely present, as evidenced by God's conversations with Homer, but in which the relationship between human appeal to the divine and divine response is unpredictable and not governed by the rules that the official religious institution teaches. The church teaches that prayer is answered in accordance with divine will. The show depicts prayer as being answered in accordance with comedic necessity, which is a different rule set and one that does not care about the institutional framework of the church's theology. This is the show being honest about the specific kind of universe it has constructed. Springfield is a universe in which the divine exists and is accessible, but in which the institutional mediators of that divine access, the church, the clergy, the formalized theology, are not reliable conduits. God talks to Homer because Homer is the main character, not because Homer is the most spiritually deserving. The divine in Springfield follows the logic of story rather than the logic of theology, and this makes the church's entire institutional apparatus unnecessary in the show's universe. If God speaks to Homer directly, the church is at best an intermediary that is being bypassed, and at worst a bureaucratic structure that has interposed itself between the divine and the human without serving any useful function in the relationship. Lovejoy's burned-out ministry is not a failure of faith. It is the logical outcome of running an institution that the show's own cosmology has rendered redundant. One last detail about Springfield's religious architecture before we move on. The church steeple. The steeple of the First Church of Springfield is visible in establishing shots of the town, in much the same way that the nuclear plant's cooling towers are visible. Both landmarks appear in the background of Springfield's skyline. Both are persistent visual presences in the show's geographic vocabulary. But there is an asymmetry in how the show treats these two skyline features. The nuclear plant is consistently in the foreground of the show's visual attention. It appears in episode after episode as an active, operative, narrative-relevant presence. It is where Homer works. It is where the dangers come from. It is the source of the contamination and the economic power and the institutional control that the Burns theory identifies as Springfield's organizing structure. The church steeple is visible in the skyline, but it is rarely in the foreground. It is background, presence without operability. An institution that exists in the community's visual landscape but does not operate as a genuine force in the community's life with anything like the consistent narrative relevance of the plant. The plant and the church are both skyline features of Springfield. One of them runs the town. The other is visible from where the running happens. That is the religious landscape of Springfield, reduced to its simplest visual statement. The spiritual is present. It is in the background. And the material, the industrial, the economic power of the plant is in the foreground, running everything, always. Section 10. The supporting cast's hidden depths: Barney, Lenny, Carl, and the lives nobody asked about. Homer Simpson's friends are one of the show's great, unexamined resources. For 36 years, Barney Gumble and Lenny Leonard and Carl Carlson have occupied positions in the show's social architecture that are defined, primarily, by their relationship to Homer. They are his drinking companions, his co-workers, his support system in the specific and limited way that Homer requires support. They are the people who are there when Homer is there, who laugh at the things Homer laughs at, who exist, within the show's narrative logic, to populate the social world that Homer inhabits. And each of them, examined more closely, is a person of considerably more complexity, more hidden depth, and more buried tragedy than the supporting character role typically reveals. Let's start with Barney. Barney Gumble was, before he became the town drunk, something different. The show has established this through flashbacks and through occasional references to Barney's pre-alcoholic life. Barney was intelligent. The show has depicted him as a former student of promise, someone who had academic ability and, apparently, the intellectual engagement that might have taken him somewhere beyond a bar stool at Moe's. The specific origin of Barney's alcoholism is, in the show's canon, attributed to Homer. In a flashback episode, Homer, facing the social pressures of a party where he wanted to look cool, gives a younger Barney his first beer. The scene is played as a joke. Homer inadvertently destroyed his friend's life. It is funny. It moves on. But what it means is that Barney's entire adult life trajectory, the decades on the bar stool, the social isolation, the loss of whatever potential the pre-alcoholic Barney possessed, was initiated by a single casual act by the person who considers himself Barney's best friend. Homer gave Barney the first beer. Homer went on to become a nuclear plant safety inspector with a family and a house. Barney spent the subsequent decades in the bar. The show acknowledges this. It acknowledges it in the specific way that The Simpsons acknowledges most of its darkest truths, which is to note it in a comedic context, to let it land as a joke, and then to move forward without examining what it means for the relationship between the two men. What it means, if you follow it, is that Homer's social life is built partly on the wreckage of Barney's potential. The same man who is too cognitively limited to connect the dots of his own situation is also too cognitively limited to fully reckon with what his casual thoughtlessness did to the person sitting next to him at the bar. Barney does not blame Homer. The show has never depicted Barney as harboring resentment toward Homer for the beer incident. Either Barney does not know, or Barney has processed it in a way that does not produce resentment, or the show simply does not have time for this particular emotional reckoning within the comedic structure it has built. All three of these may be true simultaneously. Barney's brief sobriety, depicted in an episode where he gets sober and reveals himself to be a filmmaker of genuine artistic vision, is the most concentrated portrait the show has ever produced of Barney's hidden interior life. The episode in question shows Barney sober and reveals in his sobriety a person of real sensitivity and real artistic intelligence. His films are good. Not good in a joke way, not good as the punchline of a gag about the unexpected talents of the town drunk. good in a genuine way. The show takes his artistic vision seriously and depicts the town's response to it as genuine recognition of something real. And then he relapses. He finds a beer in the bouquet of non-alcoholic champagne that celebrates his sobriety, and the relapse takes him. The artistic voice disappears. The filmmaker is gone. The bar stool reopens to receive him. The episode is devastating in a way that the show does not often permit itself to be, because the relapse is not a joke, it is a loss. The person who existed in Barney's sobriety, the filmmaker, the sensitive observer, the man with something to say and the artistic skill to say it, that person is real. He existed. And he is now back behind the alcoholism, inaccessible, buried under the specific kind of chemical dependence that the show has been depicting as comedy for 36 years. Barney's artistic talent is not a one-off gag. It is an authentic portrait of what is lost when addiction takes hold of a person. There is someone in there. Someone with real gifts and real vision and real things to offer. And the alcoholism has taken that person and replaced him, in the world's perception, with the town drunk. The butt of jokes. The background character at the bar. The show knows this. The episode about Barney's sobriety makes clear that the show knows this. And then it puts Barney back on the bar stool and continues. This is the specific cruelty of the show's relationship to Barney. It has always known who he really is. It has revealed it once, clearly, with genuine emotional weight. And then it has continued to use him as a background comedy character, allowing what it revealed to sit in the viewer's memory as an unresolved ache. The filmmaker is still in there. The barstool just has him right now. Lenny Leonard is the least examined of Homer's close friends. And the examination he deserves is the most interesting, precisely because of what the show has kept ambiguous. Lenny is smart. This is a detail that the show establishes without much fanfare across many episodes. He is a graduate of MIT. He has a master's degree. He is, by educational background, significantly more credentialed than his position at the nuclear plant would suggest. And the show has never provided a convincing explanation for why a person with Lenny's educational background is working alongside Homer in the bowels of a nuclear plant in Sector 7G. The most compelling answer, and the one the show implies without stating, is that Lenny is in Springfield. And Springfield, for all the reasons we have spent this entire script examining, is not a place where educational credentials translate into the kind of career trajectory that the institution that granted them would anticipate. MIT produces graduates who go on to distinguished careers in technology and research and engineering. MIT also apparently produced Lenny, who went back to Springfield and took a job at the plant. This is not a failure of Lenny's intelligence or his education. It is, in the show's logic, a portrait of Springfield's effect on the people who belong to it. The pull of the familiar, the community, the specific social connections that place has to offer, can outweigh the abstract opportunities that a credential might open elsewhere. And once you are back in Springfield, the institutional gravity of the town, the Burns Empire and its satellite economy, makes the plant the obvious employment choice. Lenny's MIT degree sits in his past as an indication of what might have been, and his presence in Sector 7G sits in his present as an indication of what Springfield does to what might have been. Carl Carlson is more explicitly educated than the show usually notes, and his education is more relevant to his workplace position than Lenny's. Carl has been depicted as having advanced degrees in various sciences, and his intelligence registers more clearly in the show's depiction of his workplace behavior. He is often the person who understands the technical dimensions of a situation that Homer is making worse. Carl's background is also notable for a dimension that the show has addressed with varying degrees of depth across its run. He is black, in a town that is otherwise almost uniformly depicted through a narrow racial lens. The show has not always handled this aspect of Carl's character with the same care it has applied to other character dimensions, and the inconsistency in how the show has engaged with Carl's racial identity across 36 years is itself a subject worthy of more attention than this script can give it. What is worth noting here is that Carl's position at the plant, alongside Lenny and Homer, represents a specific convergence of Springfield's social demographics. The plant is an equalizer of a certain kind, in that it employs people across educational and social backgrounds in the same physical space, doing work that has the same basic relationship to their credentials. Carl's advanced degrees do not, in the plant's operating structure, give him a different role than Homer's non-credentials. They all work in Sector 7G. They all answer to the same management structure. They are all subject to the same exposure risks and the same institutional dysfunction. The plant flattens the distinctions that education and background would normally create. Not upward, not by elevating Homer to Carl's level, but downward, by placing everyone in the same undifferentiated labor pool that the plant requires. This is the company town's most powerful social trick. It takes a diverse and differentially credentialed workforce and places them all in the same physical space doing the same undifferentiated labor, which creates the illusion of equality while actually just lowering everyone's ceiling to the same height. The friendship between Homer, Lenny, and Carl is one of the show's most consistently warm relationships, and it is worth examining what makes it work in the context of everything else we have discussed about Springfield's social landscape. The three of them have nothing in common except Springfield and the plant. Their educational backgrounds are wildly different. Their intelligence levels are measurably different. Their social and cultural backgrounds are different. If they were placed together in any other context, it is not obvious that they would become friends. But they were placed together in Springfield, in the plant, in Moe's bar, night after night, year after year. And the specific circumstances of their coexistence, the shared workplace and the shared social landscape, and the shared basic condition of being working-class men in a company town with limited options for how to spend a life, produced a friendship that has lasted 36 years. This is one of the show's most honest observations about how friendships form. Not through elective affinity, not through shared interests or shared values or the deliberate cultivation of connection, through proximity, through the simple fact of being in the same place at the same time for long enough that the relationship becomes something worth maintaining. The friendship between Homer, Lenny, and Carl is a friendship of circumstances, and in Springfield, circumstances are the most powerful force shaping relationships, because the town's limited social landscape does not provide many opportunities for the kind of elective community building that more socially rich environments permit. You end up friends with the people who are there. And in Springfield, the people who are there are usually there because they have no better option, which makes Springfield's friendships, however genuine they are, also expressions of its constraints. Professor Frink is one of Springfield's most interesting peripheral figures, and he belongs in this section because he represents, more clearly than perhaps any other supporting character, the specific fate of exceptional intelligence in Springfield. Frink is a genuine scientist, depicted across the show's run as someone with extraordinary technical and intellectual gifts. He invents things. He understands things. He operates at a scientific level that is far beyond anything Springfield society requires or can absorb. His inventions consistently fail to be adopted. His scientific insights consistently fail to be understood. He operates, in Springfield, as a kind of eccentric background presence, the scientist who does genuine science in a town that has no use for it. The specific sadness of Frink's situation is different from Barney's or from Sideshow Bob's, because Frink does not appear to experience it as sadness. He is not bitter. He is not resentful. He continues doing science with what appears to be genuine enthusiasm, apparently unconcerned by the town's consistent failure to benefit from or even understand what he is producing. This is either a portrait of the rare person who is genuinely self-sufficient in their intellectual life, who does not need external validation or social uptake of their work to find the work meaningful, or it is a portrait of someone so thoroughly absorbed in their own cognitive world that they have not registered how thoroughly Springfield has failed to engage with it. Either reading is interesting. The self-sufficient reader produces a Frink who is the show's most psychologically healthy character, someone who has found a way to live fully in Springfield without needing Springfield to be other than what it is. The oblivious reader produces a Frink who is one of Springfield's saddest cases, a brilliant man cheerfully performing work that no one will ever benefit from or understand, in a town that is too cognitively damaged by radiation to register the gap. The show has always left this ambiguous, and the ambiguity, sustained across 36 seasons, is itself a kind of care. Whatever Frink is, he is not being simplified. He is being allowed to be complicated in the background, as part of the texture of a town that contains more complexity than it usually shows. Apu Nahasapi Mapedalon deserves a moment of genuine attention here, separate from his economic situation, because his character trajectory across the show's long run represents one of the most complicated legacies in the show's history. Apu was, for many years, one of the show's most recognizable supporting characters. The Quick E-Mart was a constant location. Apu's voice and mannerisms were recognizable far beyond the show's fan base. He was, in a real sense, one of the show's most visible cultural exports. And the specific way in which Apu was constructed, the accent, the cultural trappings, the range of jokes built around his immigrant identity, has been the subject of serious and legitimate criticism that the show has not always handled with full grace. The conversation about Apu's representation, brought to wide public attention by the documentary film The Problem with Apu, asked questions about the show's choices that the show had not previously been required to answer publicly. The show's response was not one of its finest moments. Rather than engaging seriously with the critique, which it could have done, which would have been difficult but potentially generative, the show made a joke of it. An episode briefly acknowledged the controversy and then dismissed it with a line about how everything would work out, delivered with a self-congratulatory lightness that satisfied no one who had raised the concern seriously. Apu subsequently became less visible in the show. His appearances grew fewer. He was not written out with the kind of directness that would have constituted a response to the controversy. He simply receded. The show avoided the problem by making the character less present, which is a specific and familiar kind of institutional avoidance that is recognizable precisely because it does nothing to address the underlying issue while appearing to take it seriously. What is interesting about Apu in the context of this section is that the controversy itself revealed something about the show that the show was not prepared to examine: its relationship to the communities it claims to represent. Springfield is described as everywhere, as every American town, as a universal portrait of American community life. But the specific choices made in constructing characters like Apu reveal the specific perspective from which that universal was being constructed. A universal portrait that includes Apu as constructed is not actually universal. It is a portrait from a specific position, using a specific set of assumptions about what is funny and what is representationally neutral, and what is simply the texture of the world. Those assumptions were not examined publicly for many years, and when they were examined, the show was not particularly gracious about it. This is not a reason to dismiss the show's achievements, but it is a reason to hold them honestly alongside the specific limitations that produced this particular failure. The Simpsons has always been most interesting when it is willing to look at itself clearly. The Apu controversy was a moment when it was not, and the show's response or lack thereof is part of its history. The final supporting character we will spend time with in this section is the one who has been present since the first episode and has received perhaps the least attention of any character who has been present since the first episode: Maggie Simpson. Yes, we have covered Maggie in the source material, but the specific angle of Maggie as a member of the supporting cast, as a character who is perpetually present and perpetually unexamined by the show's primary narrative focus, places her in a different frame. Maggie is always there, in every family scene, in every house scene. In every sequence that takes place in the Simpson home, Maggie is present, watching, processing, maintaining the quality of attention that the show has established as her fundamental characteristic. She is never absent. She is never off-screen in the specific way that supporting characters are sometimes off-screen, just not included because the scene doesn't require them. Maggie is always there because she is always watching. And what she has watched over 36 seasons is the entire history of the Simpson family. Every fight between Homer and Marge, every crisis, every resolution, every moment where the family's fragile stability was threatened, and every moment where it held. Every instance of Homer's catastrophic decision-making, every expression of Marge's patient, strained love, every performance of Bart's rebellion and every revelation of the anxiety beneath it, every triumph and every exhaustion of Lisa's perpetual quest for meaning in a community that does not value the kind of meaning she seeks. Maggie has seen all of it, from the floor, from the backseat, from the corner of the room where the camera does not quite focus because it is focused on the person in the foreground. What a person sees when they spend 36 years watching from the margins without speaking is a complete picture of everything. Not the version of events that the participants understand they are living. Not the narrative that Homer constructs about his own life, or the narrative that Marge maintains to keep the family stable. The actual events, the things that are visible when you are always there but never the primary focus of anyone's attention. Maggie knows everything that has happened in the Simpson family. She has the full picture, and she has said nothing. The silence of 36 years is not a void, it is an archive. Everything that has happened in that house, every dark truth and every buried fear, and every moment when one of her family members was more afraid or more sad or more lost than they let on, Maggie has it, stored away, behind the pacifier and the enormous eyes and the quality of attention that has always been, if you look closely enough, the most extraordinary thing in the room. What Maggie does with that archive is the question the show has never answered. And it may be the most important question left in Springfield. Because when she finally speaks, she will have more to say than anyone who has been speaking all along. Let the night settle around you for a moment. We have been through a great deal of Springfield tonight. The geography that refuses to be contained, the yellow that refuses to be explained, the economy that refuses to lift anyone above their starting position, the corruption that refuses to be confronted, the school that refuses to improve, the women who refuse to be adequately served by the institutions built around them, the artist who refuses to stop trying to murder a child, the religion that refuses to produce genuine spiritual contact, the friends who refuse to be as simple as they look. Springfield is full of refusals, of things that should resolve and do not, of questions that should have answers and are given only more questions, of darkness that should produce tragedy, and instead produces 36 seasons of comedy that is also, underneath, exactly as tragic as it looks. This is why the show has lasted. Not because it is funny, though it is. Not because it is warm, though it is that too. Because it has always been honest, in its specific and buried and carefully maintained way, about what American life at the working class level actually feels like, the daily accumulation of managed disappointment, the specific kind of love that persists through conditions that should destroy it, the resilience that looks, from a certain angle, like resignation, the hope that looks, from a certain angle, like denial. Homer goes to work, Marge keeps the house, Bart acts out, Lisa tries harder, Maggie watches, and outside the window the cooling towers of the plant are visible against the sky. Always visible, always there, the source of everything, and the explanation for everything, and the thing nobody in Springfield will ever fully acknowledge, because acknowledging it would require doing something about it, and doing something about it would require a kind of clarity that Springfield, for 36 seasons, has been carefully prevented from achieving. The town sleeps. The plant runs. The water carries what the plant puts in it, through the pipes and into the taps and into the glasses of the people who have lived here long enough that the taste of it no longer registers as unusual. And somewhere in the house on Evergreen Terrace, in the back of the room, in the corner where the camera doesn't quite reach, a pair of enormous eyes is watching, processing, waiting. For what, the show has never told us. For what, we may never know. But the eyes are open. And in Springfield, where everything else has been careful to stay closed, that matters. Section 11. The Simpsons Guide to Death: How Springfield Processes Mortality. Death in Springfield is complicated. Not philosophically complicated, though it is that too. Logistically complicated. The rules governing who dies and who doesn't, who stays dead and who comes back, which deaths count and which are simply forgotten, have never been clearly established. And the inconsistency is not a production failure. It is, like so many of Springfield's inconsistencies, a choice that tells you something real about the town and about the show that built it. We have touched on Hans Moleman's serial mortality and Barney's burnout, and Edna Krabappel's death, and the specific ways in which the treehouse format permits deaths the canonical show cannot. But the full portrait of how death works in Springfield deserves sustained attention, because death is the ultimate test of a fictional universe's coherence. How a story handles the permanent removal of characters from the narrative tells you what kind of story it is. The Simpsons is a story that has never quite decided what kind of story it is when it comes to death. And that indecision, maintained across 36 years, has produced something genuinely strange and genuinely worth sitting with. Let's begin with the deaths the show has treated as real. Edna Krabappel is the most recent and most significant. Her death was handled, as we discussed, with genuine emotional weight. The show acknowledged it as a permanent loss. Ned Flanders grieved. The school acknowledged the absence. The community, in whatever attenuated way Springfield is capable of community response, registered the loss. Dr. Marvin Monroe, the Springfield psychologist who appeared in early seasons and then disappeared for an extended period, returned briefly and then died. His death was treated with a kind of offhand acknowledgement that split the difference between genuine mourning and comedic dismissal. He existed. He is gone. Springfield goes on. Bleeding Gums Murphy, Lisa's jazz mentor and spiritual guide, died in a season 5 episode that is one of the show's most genuinely affecting. The death is real in the show's emotional register because Lisa's grief is real. Her loss of bleeding gums is a loss that matters narratively, that has consequences for her arc, that is not undone by the episode's end. What these deaths have in common, beyond their reality within the canonical timeline, is that they are all deaths of supporting characters whose story function has either been completed or whose loss can be borne by the show's continuing narrative without destabilizing it. None of the core Simpson family has died. None of the truly central cast has been permanently removed. The deaths that Springfield acknowledges as real are, consistently, the deaths that the show can afford to treat as real without restructuring the universe around the absence. This is the logic of the canonical show's relationship to death. It can be real for people who are not load-bearing in the show's structure. For the people who are, death cannot be allowed to stick. Homer has died a remarkable number of times by most counts of the canonical show's run. Not in Treehouse episodes. In canonical ones. He has been clinically dead and resuscitated. He has been in states that should be fatal and survived. He has fallen from heights that should kill him and walked away. His body, across 36 seasons of canonical episodes, has demonstrated a relationship to mortal injury that should not be possible. We have addressed the radiation theory explanation for this, the idea that Homer's mutation has made him physically resilient in ways that are themselves a product of the contamination. But there is another explanation that deserves its own moment. The show cannot kill Homer, not because the story would end, though it would, because Homer is the show's emotional center of gravity, and killing him would require the audience to process an emotional loss that the show is not equipped to ask of them in the context it has built. The Simpsons is, at its core, a comedy. The emotional register it has established across 36 years is one of warmth and laughter and the particular pleasure of returning to familiar characters in familiar situations. The show has built its audience relationship on a foundation of reliable comfort. Same characters, same house, same neighborhood, same family, week after week. The reliability is the product. The safety of return is what the audience has been conditioned to expect. In this context, Homer's death would not just be a plot development, it would be a breach of contract, a violation of the implicit agreement between the show and its audience that certain things, the things that constitute the show's identity, are not subject to permanent removal. Homer cannot die because Homer's death would end the contract, and the contract has been so successfully maintained for so long that ending it, even in service of a story that might genuinely merit the ending, is not something the show can do without destroying itself. Homer's immortality is not radiation, it is the audience's need, and Springfield, which has always been responsive to the needs of its inhabitants, has accommodated that need by making Homer's body indestructible, by giving him a healing rate that defies medicine, by letting him absorb impacts that should be fatal and walk away, shaking his head ready for the next scene. This is the show's most direct acknowledgement of its own artificiality. Homer cannot die because we need him not to. The show has built its impossible universe around that need. And in that sense, the radiation theory and the coma theory and the collective denial theory are all secondary to the primary truth. Springfield is impossible because we have always needed it to be impossible, because we come back to it because it cannot change. And it cannot change because we cannot let it. The viewer is the source of Springfield's magic. We are the ones who press the reset button. Every time we return to the show, every time we settle in for an episode that started before most of us were born, we are the ones who confirm that the loop continues. That Bart is still 10, that Homer is still employed, that the plant is still running, that everything is still as it was. Springfield exists in the loop because we have always been the ones maintaining it. The deaths the show has handled worst are the ones that fall between the real and the comic. The deaths of characters who are significant enough that dismissing their mortality feels wrong, but peripheral enough that treating it as genuinely tragic feels disproportionate. Captain McAllister, who appears periodically across the show's run as the nautical character associated with Springfield's harbor, has been depicted as dying in at least one canonical context that was subsequently ignored. He continues to appear. The death was not acknowledged. The continuity was quietly corrected by simply pretending the death did not occur. This kind of quiet correction is what happens when a show's writing staff changes across many years and a character's status becomes unclear. Someone writes a death that was not intended to be permanent. Someone else, not realizing the first writer had killed the character, brings them back. The continuity error is noted by fans. The show moves forward, but the accumulated effect of these quiet corrections is significant. It creates a Springfield in which death is unreliable as a permanent state, where a character's absence from episodes is not necessarily evidence of their death, where the certainty of mortality that grounds most narrative universes is absent, replaced by a softer, more negotiable relationship between characters and their continued existence. This is not a failure. It is a portrait of a specific kind of ontological environment, one in which the rules of reality are softer and more negotiable than in the world outside the show. Springfield is a place where things that should be permanent are not, where consequences that should be lasting are not, where death, like aging, like memory, like the passage of time, is subject to revision in the service of the show's ongoing need to remain what it has always been. A show that cannot let go, a town that cannot let go, an audience that will not let go. All of us, together, maintaining the loop. There is a specific episode that handles death in Springfield with more emotional complexity than most, and it is not an episode that is typically cited in discussions of the show's best work. The episode involves Homer confronting his own mortality in a relatively direct way, not through near-death experience or comedic injury, but through a medical diagnosis that suggests his life might be significantly shorter than he had assumed. The episode deals with Homer's response to this information, with what he chooses to do with the time he believes he has, and with the resolution that the show provides when the diagnosis is eventually revised. The emotional content of the episode is genuine. Homer's fear of dying, his awareness of how much he would be leaving, his specific and very Homer way of processing an existential threat by converting it into a series of action items and bucket list experiences, all of this is depicted with a tenderness that the show does not always achieve. But the resolution is what's most interesting. The diagnosis is wrong. Homer is fine. He will not die, or at least not from this. And the episode ends with Homer's relief and the family's relief and the restoration of the normal operating conditions of a show about a family that cannot die. Except that the episode's emotional content, Homer's genuine reckoning with his own mortality, does not simply disappear with the revised diagnosis. The viewer has watched Homer be afraid. The viewer has watched Homer process the possibility of loss. That emotional experience is real regardless of the narrative resolution, and it leaves a residue, a reminder that Homer is mortal in theory, that the show's impossible immortality has an asterisk, that somewhere, in the space between the comedy and the resolution, the thing that cannot happen to Homer in this show is a real thing that happens to real people. The show uses that reminder and then puts it away. The episode ends. The diagnosis is revised. Homer is fine. The loop continues. But the residue stays with the viewer. The memory of Homer afraid of dying, the specific way that fear looked on his face, rendered in the show's simplified visual register, recognizable and human in a way that the visual simplification should not permit but somehow does. That is the show at its best, using the space between comedy and reality to sneak in something true. Something about mortality and fear and the love of family that cannot be stated directly without breaking the comedic contract, but can be shown, briefly, in the gap between the diagnosis and the resolution. And then the loop clicks back into place. Homer is fine. Springfield continues. The plant is visible from the window. And somewhere, maybe, Homer remembers what it felt like to think it might end. Section 12. The music of Springfield. What Alf Clausen built in the background. The Simpsons is one of the most musically sophisticated shows in television history. This is not a claim that requires much defense. The show has, across its run, produced hundreds of original songs, instrumental themes, musical parodies, and scoring choices that constitute a body of musical work unmatched in scope and quality by any other animated series. Alf Clausen served as the show's primary composer for many years, until his replacement in a contractual change that remains one of the more controversial production decisions in the show's recent history. During his tenure, Clausen produced original orchestral scoring for every episode, working with full orchestra in a tradition that was unusual for television animation, and that gave the show's music a richness and complexity that most animated series could not match. What Clausen built, over his years with the show, was a musical language for Springfield, a specific sonic identity that told the viewer, through orchestration and theme and harmonic choice, where they were in the emotional landscape of each episode. The Springfield main theme, the plant's industrial scoring, the quiet domestic music of the house on Evergreen Terrace. Each of these is not just a piece of music. It is a sonic signature for a specific place and a specific emotional relationship to that place. The main theme of The Simpsons is one of the most recognizable pieces of television music in the world. Danny Elfman composed it, and it has been performed and recorded and covered and adapted so many thousands of times that it has become something beyond a television theme. It is a cultural object, a piece of music that carries its own history now, independent of the show that produced it. The theme has a quality that is difficult to name, but immediately recognizable. It is not a happy theme, it is not a sad theme. It is a theme that contains both simultaneously, a kind of anxious brightness, a major key setting with a harmonic instability underneath it that keeps the brightness from being simple or reassuring. The theme sounds like excitement and like worry at the same time, like the feeling of a family about to do something that might go wrong, like the specific quality of a Sunday evening when the weekend is ending and the week is about to begin. This is an extraordinarily precise piece of emotional communication, achieved in under a minute of music. Elfman captured something true about the Simpsons world in a theme that most people have heard so many times they have stopped noticing what it actually contains. The original songs that the show has produced across its run constitute a body of musical work that deserves far more sustained attention than it typically receives. The show has produced songs in virtually every genre of American popular music. Songs that are, within the show's comedic register, played for laughs. Songs that are simultaneously genuinely good examples of the genres they are parodying or working within. Songs that have achieved independent cultural circulation, that are known and loved by people who cannot always identify which episode or which character produced them. Clausen's orchestral scoring for these songs, the arrangements that supported them and gave them the musical vocabulary of their respective genres, was the invisible infrastructure of the show's musical achievement. You heard the joke, the lyric, the comedic premise. What you felt, even when you were laughing, was the musical architecture that Clausen built beneath it. Music does its deepest work when it is not the primary object of attention, when it is supporting something else, an image, a joke, a moment of emotion. The audience is watching Homer fall or Bart prank or Lisa play her saxophone, and underneath that visual attention, the music is doing something to the emotional coloring of the scene that the viewer is not consciously registering. Clausen understood this. His scoring choices for 30-plus years were consistently calibrated to do emotional work that the comedy could not do alone. To reach underneath the joke and touch something true, to make the funny moments funnier and the sad moments more sad and the moments that were both at once more bearable. The loss of his scoring when his contract was not renewed is one of the show's quietest recent tragedies. Not a character death, not a plot development, but a change in the sonic signature of the show that the audience felt, perhaps without being able to articulate precisely what had changed. The music is different now. The emotional coloring is different. The architecture that was doing all that invisible work for 30 years is gone. Springfield sounds different. And the difference is not just a production change. It is the loss of a specific voice that was always doing more than most people realized, in the background of every episode, for all those years. Lisa's saxophone is the show's most emotionally significant musical object, and it deserves a final consideration here that goes beyond its function as a character prop. Lisa plays the saxophone. This is one of the most established facts in the show's canon, present since the very beginning, maintained across every season. She plays it well. The show has depicted this with enough care that the saxophone playing registers as genuine musical ability, rather than as a visual shorthand for artistic sensitivity. But why the saxophone? It is an interesting choice for a character who represents, in so many ways, the show's highest aspirations for what intelligence and art and moral seriousness can produce. The saxophone is not, in the usual cultural hierarchy of classical music, the instrument you would associate with the kind of serious, high-minded intellectualism that Lisa represents in her academic and political commitments. The saxophone is a jazz instrument. Its associations are with improvisation, with emotional expression, with a musical tradition that is rooted in African American music and that carries its own complex history in relation to the wider American musical culture. The saxophone is not the instrument you give to a child prodigy in the classical tradition. It is the instrument you give to a child who feels things too large for the formal structures available to her and needs a form of expression that can accommodate that size. Lisa plays the saxophone because Lisa's inner life is too large for the available structures. Her intelligence is too large for Springfield Elementary. Her moral seriousness is too large for the community's capacity for moral engagement. Her emotional depth is too large for a family that is doing its best but is operating with limited resources for the kind of depth she needs. The saxophone is her pressure valve. It is the thing that lets out what cannot be contained. And the show, in its quietest and most careful moments, depicts this with real fidelity. Lisa, with her saxophone, alone, playing in a way that is sometimes about music, and sometimes about everything that has happened in the episode, and sometimes about something that is beyond the episode's specific events, and is just the general weight of being Lisa. Simpson in Springfield. The saxophone scenes are the show's most honest access to what it is actually about. Not the jokes, not the plots, not the guest stars or the cultural references or the satirical observations about American life. A girl, in a town that cannot contain her, playing music into the air because it is the only place big enough to put everything she carries. That is The Simpsons. That is what all of this has been building toward. 36 seasons of jokes and darkness and buried truth and impossible geography and yellow skin and a plant that poisons everything. And in the middle of all of it, a girl with a saxophone playing. And the music goes out the window and up into the Springfield sky and over the cooling towers of the plant and across the river with the three-eyed fish and through the streets of a town that exists everywhere and nowhere and has been running for 36 years without anyone ever really managing to explain it. The music goes out, and Springfield, for a moment, is quieter than it was. And then the next episode starts, and everything begins again. Outro, closing narration. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight. Geography that defies itself, color that hides a symptom, economics that prevent escape, crime that fills the vacuum left by civic failure, education that manages its own inadequacy, women whose ambition is redirected and redirected and redirected until it finds the path of least resistance back to the shape that the town can tolerate. An artist turned villain by a community that could not accommodate his gifts. Horror that is simply the canonical show's darkness at higher contrast. Religion performing itself in an empty room. Friends whose depth exceeds the roles they have been given. Death that is real for some people and negotiable for others. Music doing its invisible work in the background, always. All of this is in The Simpsons. All of it has been there since the beginning, or close to it. In the background. In the margins. In the details that reward the kind of slow, patient attention that the show has always been slightly too fast and slightly too funny to require. But here, tonight, we have had the time. And what the time reveals is not a simpler show than the one you thought you knew. It is a more complicated one. A more honest one. One that has been doing things, quietly and consistently, that most television does not attempt to do. Not just making you laugh, though it does make you laugh. Making you laugh at things that are real. Making the real things bearable by making them funny. Using the comedy as a container for truths that might otherwise be too heavy to carry. Springfield is not a place you would choose to live. The water is questionable, the air is questionable, the civic institutions are broken, the economic mobility is nil. The power plant dominates the skyline, and the billionaire who owns it has been alive for over a century and knows what it is doing to the people below. And yet, the family is real. The love is real. The friendship between Homer and Lenny and Carl, built on nothing but proximity and time, is real. The music that Lisa sends out the window every evening is real. The forgiveness that Ned cannot help extending, even when it costs him everything, is real. The specific courage of Marge, keeping her household stable across decades of instability, is real. Springfield is a town that should not work. That should have collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions decades ago. That should have been investigated and regulated and held accountable for what it has done to its residents and its environment and its children. It has not collapsed. It has not been fixed. And the people inside it, the yellow people in the impossible town on the edge of the impossible geography, with the plant always visible in the background, have kept living. Not because they do not know what is wrong, not because they are too damaged to see, but because the alternative to living in a broken place is not, for most of them, a better place. It is just no place. Just the absence of everything that the broken place for all its brokenness, still provides family, friends, a bar where you know everyone's name, a school where the children learn something, even if not enough, a church where the community gathers, even if the gathering is mostly performance, a plant that keeps the lights on, even if the light comes at a cost that nobody has calculated fully. Springfield is worth loving because the things inside it that are worth loving are real, and the things that are wrong with it are also real, and they are worth knowing about, and they are worth sitting with, the way we have sat with them tonight. Slowly, without urgency, in the dark, with the town spread out around us, the cooling towers visible in the distance, the river carrying its particular water toward the harbor looking out toward the ocean that appears and disappears depending on which episode you're watching. Springfield does not make sense. It has never made sense. And it is, for reasons that are themselves part of its impossibility, exactly where 36 years of very smart and very funny and very honest people have chosen to spend their working lives. That is the greatest mystery of all. Not what the radiation is doing. Not whether Homer is dreaming. Not who shot Mr. Burns. The greatest mystery is this: why does a show about a broken town, built on buried darkness, populated by mutated people who have forgotten how to question their own reality, feel like coming home? Why does Springfield, of all places, feel like home? Maybe because all places are broken. Maybe because every community contains its own version of the plant in the background, and the water you have decided not to test, and the civic leaders you have agreed to stop expecting better from. Maybe because every family has its own Homer, its own Marge, its own Bart running from something, and its own Lisa trying to fix something, and its own Maggie watching everything and saying nothing and waiting. Maybe Springfield feels like home because the world outside it is also Springfield, and we have all been drinking the water for so long that the taste of it no longer registers as unusual. Or maybe it is simpler than that. Maybe Springfield feels like home because we have been going there every week for 36 years, and something that you return to that consistently, that reliably, across that much of your life, has a way of becoming part of you regardless of what it is. We are all Springfieldians now. We have been for a long time. The plant is still running, the family is still on the couch, the saxophone is playing somewhere in the house, and the music is going up into the air, and the night is quiet around it. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. That is the whole point. Section 14. Springfield at night. What the town looks like when nobody is watching. There is a version of Springfield that the show almost never depicts, and its absence from the 36-year visual record is itself something worth noticing. Springfield at night. The show has nighttime scenes. It has evening scenes, after-dark scenes, scenes set in the specific kind of suburban late-evening quiet that falls over a neighborhood after the children have gone inside and the last of the daylight has faded from the sky. But the town itself, the full civic landscape of Springfield as a place that exists when no episode is happening, when no camera is positioned, when none of the characters are moving through it on their way to whatever the plot requires, that Springfield at night is never seen. What would it look like? The plant certainly would be running. Nuclear power plants do not have hours. They are continuous operations, running through the night with the same steady generation of electricity that they produce through the day, the same controlled reactions, sustaining the same invisible contamination of the same water supply that flows through the town whether anyone is awake to drink it or not. The plant at night is identical to the plant at noon. The cooling towers exhale their steam into the dark sky. The lights of the facility are reflected in the river below it. The river carries its water southward, or in whatever direction Springfield's river flows, which, like everything else about the town's geography, is somewhat ambiguous. The water carries what the plant puts into it. The water does not rest at night. The contamination does not pause. Moe's Tavern would be open. It has always been open at late hours. The bar does not close when Springfield winds down. The last of the evening's drinkers would be there, in the specific communion of late-night bar culture, which is different from the communion of early evening bar culture in ways that anyone who has experienced both would recognize. The early evening is social. The late evening is something else, more interior, more honest, sometimes. The kind of conversations that happen at a bar at midnight are conversations that do not happen at 7 in the evening, because the hour does something to people, loosens certain inhibitions and tightens certain others, and what comes out in the loosening is often something closer to true than what comes out in the ordinary social hours. Homer has been in Moe's at late hours. Barney is almost always there. Whatever Barney says at midnight to the other people at the bar, the things he says in the later hours when the carefully maintained distance between the drunk and the man inside the drunk is thinner, the show has never quite depicted those conversations. But they happen. They must happen. And they are probably the most honest conversations anyone in Springfield ever has. The Simpson house at night is a different kind of quiet than the house during the day. Homer and Marge sleep in the bedroom that has, across many episodes, been established as large enough or small enough depending on the scene's requirements. They sleep in the specific proximity of two people who have shared a bed for many years, who know the shape of the other person's presence in the dark, who have calibrated their respective sleep behaviors to accommodate each other in the specific way that long-term cohabitation produces. Bart's room is down the hall. In the nights that the show has depicted, Bart's room is not quiet in the way that sleeping children's rooms are supposed to be quiet. Bart is a child who worries more than he shows. The pranks and the rebellions and the persistent refusal to engage with the academic apparatus of Springfield Elementary are all, in their own way, expressions of anxiety. Of the specific anxiety of a child who is perceptive enough to sense that his world is not quite right, but does not have the vocabulary or the context to articulate what is wrong. Bart, in his room at night, is not sleeping easily. The show has suggested this across many episodes. In the rare moments when it allows Bart's interior life access to the surface, he is a child who does not want to be seen worrying, who has constructed over the course of his young life a public persona of cheerful invulnerability that serves the function of keeping people from looking too closely at what is underneath it. Underneath it, in his room at night, is a 10-year-old who loves his family and is afraid of the things that threaten them and does not know how to express that fear in any register other than the pranks that get him in trouble and the loyalty that surprises everyone who assumes he is only the trouble. Lisa's room is across the hall from Bart's. In the nights that the show has depicted, Lisa is awake, reading or thinking or playing her saxophone softly enough not to wake the house. She is the family member most likely to be conscious while the others sleep, because she is the family member with the most active inner life and the least tolerance for the specific kind of unconsciousness that sleep requires. Lisa at night, in her room, is the show's most honest portrait of what it looks like to be very intelligent in a world that cannot fully accommodate you. She is alone in a way that she is not quite alone during the day, when other people are present even if they cannot reach her. At night, the aloneness is complete. Just Lisa, and her books, and her saxophone, and the dark outside the window, and the plant visible against the sky if you look at the right angle, and the awareness, always there, that the world is what it is and she is what she is and the gap between them is not going to close. Maggie is asleep, or appears to be asleep. Maggie's relationship to sleep, like Maggie's relationship to everything, is not entirely visible to anyone in the house. She is in her crib in the parents' room, or in her own room in other episodes, small and still and apparently unconscious, and watching. Even in sleep, or whatever Maggie does that looks like sleep, the quality of attention is there. The enormous eyes, closed now but ready to open. The awareness that is always running, even when the surface is quiet. Even when the house has settled into its nighttime mode and the day has formally ended. Maggie's dreaming, if she dreams, is the last unknown territory in Springfield. The show has given us access to Homer's dreams, to Bart's dreams, to Lisa's inner life in ways that approach dreaming in their depth and their honesty. But Maggie's dreams remain sealed behind the pacifier, and the enormous eyes and the 36 years of deliberate, strategic silence. What does the most intelligent person in Springfield dream about? The show will not tell us. Not yet, maybe not ever. Springfield at 3 in the morning is the quietest version of itself. The bar is closed, or nearly. The streets are empty. The plant is running its night shift with the skeleton crew that operates it through the dark hours, the people whose circadian rhythms have been permanently altered by the demands of continuous industrial operation, who move through the plant in the small hours of the morning with the specific, focused quietness of night workers everywhere. The three-eyed fish are in the river. They have always been in the river, day and night. Blinky and whatever population of mutated aquatic life has developed in the years since Blinky was first pulled from those waters and became, briefly, national news. The fish move through the water in the dark, their three eyes registering whatever they register, their mutated biology performing whatever it performs, invisible beneath the surface that the night makes darker than the day. The gorge is there, deep and quiet. The sound of water at its bottom, if there is water at its bottom in this episode's geography, not reaching the surface. The gorge does not sleep, it is geology. It does not have a relationship to the passage of time in the same way that the town above it does. It was there before Springfield. It will be there after. Whatever Springfield's ultimate fate, the gorge will remain. A wound in the landscape that no amount of civic denial or collective amnesia or radiation-induced cognitive damage can close or fill or make into something other than what it is. The church steeple, lit from below by a small lamp, is visible against the night sky. The first church of Springfield, marking its corner of the civic landscape with the quiet persistence of institutions that have been doing the same thing in the same place for long enough that their persistence has become part of the landscape. The school is dark. The school has always been dark in the hours that it does not need to be open, and the darkness is not restful. It is the darkness of a building that is old and tired and has been processing children for decades without sufficient investment in its own maintenance, so that even its darkness has a worn quality, an exhausted quality, the darkness of a building that is doing the best it can with what it has. And Evergreen Terrace is the quietest of all the quiet. The street where the Simpsons live and where Ned Flanders lives next door, where the specific social ecosystem of their intersection has been playing out for 36 years, the houses are dark, the lawns are damp with whatever the early morning hours produce in the way of dew or frost or rain, depending on which version of Springfield's climate the most recent episode established. Springfield at night is a town at rest, or performing rest, or resting in the way that a place rests when the thing that makes it what it is, the human presence, the conflict, the comedy, the darkness, the love, is temporarily suspended in sleep and will resume at dawn with whatever the next episode brings. The plant runs, the river flows, the gorge waits, the school sits in its tired darkness, the church marks its corner, and in the house on Evergreen Terrace, 4 people breathe. Springfield breathes with them, in and out, slowly, the way things breathe when they are old and established and know that morning will come and the loop will begin again, and whatever happened yesterday will be reset, and whatever happens tomorrow will also eventually be reset, and the permanent present of this impossible town will continue to present itself as the only reality its residents have ever known. In and out, the plant visible against the sky, the yellow faces quiet in their beds. Sleep well,